Oh, here's Omar. Okay.
Okay. All right, Frank, take it
Great.
away.
Yeah, I'm just going to, again, introduce it, go through it, through pretty much the waterfront chapter, and then I'll turn this to Simon on discussion for downtown, which we'd like to get into tonight. So our fifth committee meeting, and we've talked about the Zoom guidelines, and we've also talked about sort of the project schedule, but I'll just highlight a little bit about that in a few minutes. And again, we hope to go, we'll go as long as necessary, but we kind of thought of the 7 to 9 sort of timeline for this evening. So here's the agenda to go through a little bit. The draft plan sections, also a little waterfront discussion, because you've all had that chapter now sent to you. And then after that, we'd get into sort of the downtown and economic development, just to highlight what we're going to be writing and hopefully sending to you prior to the next meeting. And then Simon's going to touch on some community engagement updates. So I think, Simon, you can, these next two slides, I think at this point we are getting to know fairly well. So I think everyone is familiar with the committee meeting, and everyone's familiar with the staff, village key staff who's on the call, and ourselves. So project schedule you've seen a bit, but I think we'd like to just highlight a couple of things that we are doing. Just so you know, on the yellow down there, and I think you may know this already, but the village board has now declared itself lead agency to carry out the State Environmental Quality Review Act. So they've taken the first step, and then we'll be providing them some other material so they can make what's called a declaration of significance. But having talked with the village board now, we expect that to possibly be a positive declaration, and then be in a position to schedule scoping perhaps for September or late September into October. So we've started that process, just so everyone knows. So we're sort of on schedule there. And all scoping is, and I'm sure that when they said it, everyone would be invited. So we'll hope the committee can participate in that. Scoping just outlines the DEIS. So for that, we've got the items in the EIS that the state requires, and also that you want, at a local level to be covered. We're also working, I'm going a little bit backwards because the comprehensive plan update and where we are, but the zoning code, we have started now more work. Jonathan Martin is on this call, and Mark Evans together are starting some work on a downtown form-based code, which is, we'd like to come back and discuss with you. And also, just so the mayor had asked for a sort of just a review of what form-based zoning is, and we're trying to schedule that now for September. We're just waiting to get a date for that. So those things are also happening at the same time as the comprehensive plan update. And this next slide, I think we can go to, gives you a little bit more on the plan chapters and what we're working on now. As you know, we did the waterfront chapter and got that to you. And tonight we hope, as you can see here, July 21, just to talk to you about both that chapter and the downtown and economic chapter, to highlight that a bit. And then you can see it here, August 18th, we're hoping to do sort of infrastructure, which would include transportation, as well as public facilities and utilities together. And on that meeting, we hope to have Joe Cermelli available. You all know Joe from Kellard Sessions, and also Tina Lund, because part of that is also going to discuss schools. And then we hope to get 2 more chapters done into you, housing and culture and history. You see them here in September for the September 15th meeting. And then at that point, you will have the chapters. It doesn't mean we've revised them. They're still iterative. They're still works in progress. But that is exactly when state law suggests. You can see up at the top the committee public hearing. State law is very permissive as to how you do the process, but this is one of the things it says that the committee should hold a public hearing during the development of the plan. So I think before we get to possibly an action agenda or end of the plan, you might want to hold that hearing in October, November, so that you get official input, if you will, from the public. Obviously, we're having as much of an outreach as we can to the public. Simon's going to go over some of those later. But the law does require that public hearing by the committee before you then send the draft. It's still a draft to the trustees. So that's where we are so far. And I hope we're making.
Before you go on to the next slide, I'd like to make a couple of points to the committee. So one of the problems that we've had with some of these.
I mean, did you say go to the next slide?
No, I did not. I said I want to.
Don't go. Okay. Yep.
So basically, one of the challenges I think that we've seen here from the staff perspective is that sometimes these meetings can get, they can get a little lectury, right? So we're sort of like they're being presented to you as committee members. You're listening. You're sort of getting a lot of information, but unfortunately, we're not really getting enough of the feedback I think that we would hope to get. And so I kind of want to pause here to ask everyone on the committee to thoughtfully look at the timeline and think about whether or not this process that we're going through is helpful. And I want to encourage you throughout this entire discussion today, because there are a lot of changes I think that Simon has made to the presentation to really try to build up some engagement from you as a group through this process. But I want you to try to be as thoughtful as possible, even in the little boring, mundane tasks of just looking at the timeline and the scheduling of how we're reviewing and putting together this comprehensive plan, whether you have any comments. And if you do, shout them out. Let BFJ know. Let us know if there's anything that any comments you want to get into the side, because it really is critically important for you to understand that we have to have the feedback of this committee in order to produce a document that's going to be what the community wants.
Let me react to that, because after every meeting so far, I have sent to all of the group extensive thoughts and notes per email. And it is not always easy during the meeting to go into lengthy diversions because you have a major program to present. But so then the only option I see is to absorb what is being presented and then afterwards send out my thoughts to you. But so far my experience is that nobody ever has reacted to it. So, and those notes are really made to indeed help to encourage some sort of discussion where we are actually going with this whole plan and what is important to put in there while we are building it up.
I think, yeah, Frank, that's a good point. I think we are trying to listen. I hope you got Simon's email back to you today, but you'll see later in this presentation, we have some thoughts on a couple of items you mentioned. So
yes, you responded to that, but there are also the members of this committee, and from those members, I have heard absolutely nothing.
Well,
I'll chime in if I can, Frank.
I don't know how to improve that, but
because I definitely have some thoughts. And I guess I should specify which Frank. Thank you, Frank Fish. I'm gonna jumping in Frank Pudding. I'm gonna respond to you. I have a huge amount of gratitude for the thoughts that you emailed to the group, because it is through that kind of conversation that we're able to move forward. I'll tell you, for me, coming from an education background, and I'm sure Melissa can speak to this as well, there are different kind of ways that people learn. And so for some visual learners, having this kind of chapter timeline, for an example, can be really engaging and spark a lot of thoughts. For others, maybe that are more auditory learners, a conversation could be a little bit better. I think it's particularly tough for people that are kinesthetic learners that learn best when they're moving around. The fact that we are static and in one room and never actually seeing these places in person, how much would it be brought to life if we could actually go to these different places as a committee, meet, discuss, have a coffee? That would add so much value. So in terms of what we can do given where we are, what I would love to see is to have optional, well, you can think of them as kind of like study halls, where every couple of weeks or so, the cadence can kind of range. But for me, having some sort of informal touch point with the committee in between meetings where we're able to discuss, okay, it's like this meeting, what we're going to do for 30 minutes, we'll discuss just the last chapter that BFJ has written and thoughts that you have. And we can like talk through things that we noticed. How are you approaching it? As somebody that is reading through, let's say, the Waterfront chapter that was just written, you know, it's a beefy document. There are a lot of details there. And for somebody that hasn't sat through, like, could you really tell me the difference between the Cornell design recommendations and Columbia study in terms of, like, could you really break that down? Can everybody break that down for me? Because I would actually love for somebody to break that down for me. I have a general sense of what's going on, but having that kind of conversation informally, I think, is something that would be super valuable. So that's something that Hyman, we can discuss afterward in terms of like how the staff can help facilitate that. But I do think that there are different ways. Email for folks like Frank Budding that really engage with the written word, Zoom meetings that are 30 to 45 minutes in length, something bite-sized where we can discuss concrete topics to have less formal conversations. And then having like really clear what are the outcomes that we're hoping for these different parts of the conversation. So even something like the timeline, the question may be, how might COVID impact our timeline? And then put that question out to the group. I think to me, that is a very engaging question, particularly given the fact that my take is, and it's just me talking here, but part of the challenge is that you both have a worldwide pandemic, which is not just still playing out, but in many parts of our country, spiking at a time when that's not actually happening in parts of the world. And so we're trying to figure out how to mitigate that. And then we also have a social justice movement that is now unprecedented, the largest of its kind in our history, that is so new and so in flux that we actually don't even have a name for it. Like when you talk about the 60s, it was a civil rights movement. We have a name for that. We don't have a name for what we call it. You could call it kind of, I guess, Black Lives Matter, but like that kind of captures it. But there's no popular way of describing what we're living because we're so in the middle of it. So we're asking, how might that impact a plan that goes through February of next year? Like, who knows? It's very difficult to say, but I'm sure that we can surmise, given the different viewpoints that we have, ways that it impacts the schools or the planning boards or whatever. So those are just some thoughts to chew on. Eager to hear from the rest of the board.
Okay. Well, actually, we're going to have, when we, about 3 or 4 slides from now, we were planning to take a pause on that Waterfront chapter and have a sort of, I hadn't thought of calling it an optional study hall, but I like that description, is to take a pause in the slide presentation and sort of talk about it.
I mean, I got your note there on the study hall. I really like that idea. So that's something that I've already got the note down, and we're going to do that. So we'll figure out how to integrate that and who all is going to be involved, but that's a great idea.
Yeah, the thing that I would just add to what Omar proposed is that these meetings are very structured and that we have a presentation during the meeting, but just the nature of Zoom, it's very difficult to interrupt with a spontaneous thought and maybe even go off on a sidetrack that's important that we need to have that conversation, and we arrive there spontaneously. So if we can have even just some unstructured time or study hall or chapter reading groups or whatever we want to call it, I would be completely endorse that and want to join in those discussions.
And Jeff, I might mention too, we've sort of discussed this just momentarily at our last meeting, but as you look at this chart, each of these chapters also, they line up generally, not perfectly, but generally, with a subcommittee. And we want to make sure that you are all invited, and you have been and will be invited to all of these subcommittee meetings, which are a little bit less structured. And so I think it would be a good way also to also get input is feel free to attend any of these subcommittee meetings, which I think Jaime or Jamie will let you know about. We're gradually scheduling more of these.
Yeah, just to add on that, the next one is going to be next week on economic development, where we don't have the date yet. We're working on scheduling that with the subcommittee. But once we've got that, probably around midday on Friday, we'll invite everyone in the committee and also the Board of Trustees to that subcommittee meeting.
And also, I think the mayor's idea that I mentioned earlier of having she called it a tutorial, so you could call it a study hall on the zoning. Continuing the zoning discussion with the form-based downtown. It was just to have a discussion, and we're working on a date. I think we're targeting September 10th. I just have to make sure, we have to make sure that one key person can make it. We want you to be invited to all of those and be able to participate. So we'll have a number of different structured or unstructured meetings, but also if Jaime, Trustee Lopez, as you suggested, if staff want to set up some other more free flow discussions, that would be great.
Yeah, and then there is sort of a background study. Over dinner tonight, I was online, and here I find the Village of Ossining Local Waterfront Revitalization Program. It's a document of 285 pages, which was published in 1991 and adopted by the village. And then it's been amended in 2011. And it gives a very interesting and lengthy background information on the waterfront. And we are going to talk further about this waterfront. And I wished I had read this whole bloody document before I got into this, but I didn't even know that it existed. So it may be helpful if we actually could get alongside the meeting a reading list, a text list, if you like, so that if there are things we want to prepare ourselves for ahead of the next meeting, that we can do some background reading rather than having to fossick around or stumble upon it like this document, because I'm sure that a lot of your deliberations in your presentation on the current situation of the waterfront will actually be based up on a document like this.
Yeah.
It's a great point. That was actually something that was requested. I don't know where the source of it came, but Jaime and Karen asked that we start preparing.
I think that was a Maddie's request, and
yeah. So that's why on Wednesday we sent a similar sort of package of reading materials for today's meeting. And one thing that we're going to send around, I think Sylvia's actually done it, and I just need to take a look at it, but we'll be able to send it around this week, is sort of looking retroactively at the chapters that we've already done, including the waterfront, and providing all of those background materials that we've looked at. So I apologize that we didn't do that from the beginning, but we're going to do that for each chapter going forward, and also for the ones that we've already discussed. So we'll be sending that around in the next couple of days.
And so to go back to the original question, I just wanted to make sure, because I know that, we, again, Simon has done a lot to try to really make sure that today's meeting engages people at a high level. So to the original question, now that you've had a minute to take a look at the timeline and the plan chapters and the weight of everything, any comments specifically around that from the board? Is everybody okay with that? On board? Thumbs up? Thumbs down? Thumbs up. All right. I see one thumbs up. Two thumbs up. Thumbs up. All right. All right. Get it back, Frank.
Okay. Great.
Okay. Well, this is one that you've seen before. It's really just to highlight that we have done an initial draft now, the Waterfront chapter, which we sent to you. What we're working on is the Downtown and Economic Development chapter, and we'd like to highlight, just highlight a little bit of it tonight. Take a break after that too, and then discuss it. And then we'll be trying to write a draft of that so that you would have that for the August meeting. So that's what we're working on now. There's a couple of people starting to work on the transportation chapter. We're working, toward that in August, and then the sustainable infrastructure chapter, and that's where Kellard Sessions is going to be involved with us, as well as Urbanomics. So you'll be hearing from them during August. So
I'd like to add one thing here, which I think we've talked about, but it's important to reiterate, which is that the draft being online absolutely does not mean that it's done. Right. The reason we put them online is so that the public can also see them. We don't want to work on a draft, get some feedback from you, and then hold these back and not let the public see it until we've got a full document. We want people to be able to take a look at this along the way and send comments to Jaime and Karen if they have any. So it's just an important thing that we want all of you to understand and be on the same page with us. The fact that there are some preliminary drafts online, it's because we want more comment. We want the public to be able to see what we've been working on.
If I could jump in here for a second, having looked at the last few chapters that are on there, one of the things that stands out to me that would be really helpful is whether it's within the scope of this conversation here or during one of the study halls or whatever else, it would be really helpful to have you, Simon, or whomever else really has a sense of what these chapters are like, to get a sense of this is where we're feeling really confident, where the numbers are tight. Like, give us feedback if you have questions about, like, the mayor, for example, asked, hey, it seems like the population hasn't increased a lot given the numbers that you have, but anecdotally, like, the numbers have increased, like those kinds of questions will come up. But what are the places that you feel are squishiest that could most benefit from having some questions thrown its way? Because as I look through it, it doesn't stand out to me that, like, oh, this is a place where it's like a placeholder. They really don't know what direction they're going in. Versus this one, they have a good sense of, like, these are the studies, you're just going as a survey of existing work. So if you could give us a sense of where it would be most valuable, given the authorship, to get feedback, that would help to start the conversation for somebody like me.
Great. Yeah, that's good.
I think there's a number of these, Omar.
Yeah.
Eventually the zoning, which is going to be a product for the trustees, is a very important one. And I think the waterfront discussion tonight and then downtown are also things that lend themselves to real guidance by the committee. So we can go into it more.
I'll throw this out there real quick. I think that, you mentioned a really good idea, Omar, about, getting out there doing site visits and visiting. Maybe as a follow-up to tonight's phone call, we can set up like a site visit to the waterfront, to the downtown, to the various different areas, wherever people want to go. And we can do it during a time that's more convenient for people. So whether that's, an evening meeting or a weekend meeting or something like that, we can do something. Karen had mentioned that she had done these when she was part of the committee for 2009 comp plan. And it's, anecdotally, I think I told you earlier today, Trustee Lopez, that getting out there and, like, seeing things on the street really gives you a different perspective of what can be done and what things really are. And so I think it's hugely helpful to get that.
Agreed.
Yeah, it was very helpful for us. We took our own, we took a tour of the waterfront, actually with Jaime and Karen, did a tour of the 2 family zones, and we've done several tours of downtown now, and Jonathan Martin's done 3 or 4 follow-up visits. So yeah, and Jaime, if you do an additional one and you want one of us there, just let us know. That'd be great.
It's a nice walk, not on a day like today, but when it's a little less warm.
Yeah.
it's you really can get a lot in, and it's a good exercise. So maybe we can do like a Saturday morning walk and get some, you know, we can drive too, but walking it really makes a difference, and we really can see a lot of the different elements of what we're talking about. Again, from a firsthand perspective. So if people are interested in that, we can organize something, either an evening or Saturday morning or whatever people would be most comfortable with, what would be most convenient.
Good. Well, we've reached the waterfront where we wanted to just spend a minute with you. And that is, this is sort of just to remind us to say, you know, we've sent you sort of a discussion. We want to just discuss this tonight. Just the draft that we sent is a working draft. And we realize it's going to, you know, it will gradually get changed over time. And as more information comes in, more comments from you. What you can see here is we had an objective overall goal to the chapter of, on the one hand, trying to accommodate some mixed-use development at the waterfront. There are some regional attractions there. The proposal for the museum, for instance, at Sing Sing. You've got a ferry, you've got a train station. So there's an opportunity at the waterfront. But on the other hand, item 2 is we need to be very sensitive about the flooding, risk from flooding there and sea level rise. And of course, you'll remember we've got in the draft the maps, the floodplain maps that we've shown for that. So basically, we wanted to just take a break here and just open this up to the committee. Have we got the right balance? Have we struck this right, or do you look to some change in that overall balance? Also, we'd be very interested in your ideas on the Sing Sing Prison Museum. That idea. Are there other draws to the waterfront, as some other communities have been seeking, both north of you and south of you? And then what are the most, what are the assets that we need to protect, and the balance that would be achieved there? I would take this opportunity to mention to you that Karen and Jaime and we had a discussion with MTA just to, or I should say it's MTA's Metro North Division. We wanted to confirm, was there any regional plan by Metro North in terms of, their tracks? What do they look at long-term for flooding conditions? Because this is not just an Ossining for them, obviously. This is at many of their stations in the areas in between. The response really was not unexpected, but its clarity, I thought, was helpful in the sense that they said they don't have basically any definitive plan. There's nothing in their capital budget. And really they said their main focus right now is the running of a railroad and getting it back, getting the passengers back and getting it back to a normal circumstance. And they have no particular plan for the future. So I just wanted to we felt we needed to clarify that, because in my own mind, at least, eventually Metro North will, if they want to run a railroad, they're going to have to come up with some plan to elevate those tracks or to put them on a berm. But they have no such plan now. So we just wanted to clarify it for you. So I would turn it to the committee in terms of any ideas for the waterfront, or whether you feel our draft has a reasonable presentation of it.
So I have a question.
Yes, Rebecca.
Are we going to be like reaching out to our our residents, like people that in the community, to get their comment on this part? Or like, I felt like our role more in this was to reach out to the community and make sure that they were heard.
I think it's a little of both, if I may, and we definitely, there's several methods we're working through. One is to go through first, the committee, because you've been appointed to guide the process, if you will, on behalf of the trustees. But once you've seen something or commented on it, as you know, we're trying to get it online so the public can read it all.
Right.
And then in addition to that, as Simon will go over later, we've had an online presence through this program we have, Social Pinpoint, and we've been trying to get public input that way, as well as now the survey. We have a survey up and running. We have approximately 300 respondents so far on the survey. So we're trying these different means of getting the public response. And I think then, of course, I mentioned earlier, this is leading to a committee public hearing, which is required. And the public will have, that's why we want to get all this online, so that the worst thing for us, Rebecca, is a member of the public comes to the hearing and says, I never heard of this. I never had a chance to read it. I wasn't involved. So
Right.
we want the public to be involved as much as possible.
Right. And I thought that was more of our role, was to make sure that we would engage the part of the community that we are involved in to become involved as early on as possible, so they could give their input, because I'm not a planner and I can only offer so much, but I know, people in the community, and I'm sure that they have an opinion. I'm sure every member on the board has, people that they're involved with that have an opinion. So I just don't know if we should be reaching out at this point to the people that we are involved in and having them comment, or we're waiting. I guess.
I would say, go ahead, Jaime. Sorry, go ahead.
Let's see if I can help this a little bit.
Yep.
The reason that you're looking at a slide right now, it's, Waterfront Discussion about the draft Waterfront chapter. And so the reason that this slide is here is specifically to try to see if we can garner some responses from you as individuals on what your thoughts are for what you'd like to see in the waterfront. So what I'm going to try to do here is I'm going to maybe ask some pointed questions. I don't mean to sort of navigate around your question, Rebecca, because I think that we want you to reach out to everybody you know and tell them, hey, look online. Hey, go to the ideas wall. Read the survey. Fill out the survey. Give us all your input. But at the same time, as you've had lots of conversations with people over the years talking about, man, I wish Ossining had this. This is your opportunity to communicate, the things that you've heard, as well as your own opinions on how the waterfront chapter should be developed, how the economic development chapter should be happening. But in this meeting here, this is your opportunity to voice directly to the consultants and to the rest of us what your opinions are. So I'm going to try with some pointed questions here. Melissa.
Wait, Jaime, before you give your pointed question, if I may.
Yes.
With love and respect. Whomever is sharing the screen, would you mind, for sections like this where it's open conversation, not having the shared screen so we can all see each other?
Sure.
I think that would help.
Great.
All right.
Hit it, Jaime. It's all you.
Thank you.
Terrific.
So, Melissa, you're a board. You're on the school board, right? And I think that we all have our own ideas of what the school board is looking for, whether that's more funding or more buildings or more various different things. But we don't represent the school board. You do represent as a constituent and as a member of the school board. So, what do you think is the best kind of outcome that you could see in the waterfront? Is it an outcome that will increase the amount of tax revenue, bring down the tax rate, so that we can provide more resources to the school? Is it more school opportunities for alternative education on the waterfront? Is it more access to waterfront activities to do co-educational learning? What are the things that you think are important to find on the waterfront?
Well, from my personal perspective, of course, I could never speak for an entire board. I think it's a combination of all of that. I think, going back to Frank Budding's point about considering the COVID factor and everything that we're doing going forward, I think some multi-use, areas definitely would be beneficial. Right now, I think as we know, it's a very limited space. You have the area where there's the stage, and then you have the park further down. And I know there's geographical, constraints for how expansive we can, become down there. But I think innovating ways that can allow for more usage from the community would definitely be beneficial, most beneficial, especially given the fact that it's looking like for the foreseeable future, outdoor space is where it's at, and I think that would really benefit. I was looking
more public access spaces, like
right,
more parks, more, open area spaces that can be accessed by the public.
right. I think, also in that regard, I was looking over the draft, and I know one of the points made out was kind of like the location of the riverfront, and you have this giant hill to climb to kind of get back and forth, and then there's only like the 2 bridgeways to access the riverfront over the bridge. I would wonder if some type of shuttle option would also be part of this plan to make sure that not only people from in town can get back and forth, because parking, depending on what type of events down there, parking can fill up really quick. So that's another factor. And then if you have people coming in off of the ferry, it also makes for a way for people to kind of get into town and patronize the shops and stuff like that. So that was just something that kind of popped out of my mind when I was looking over the draft, is that making it more accessible, because not everyone is, we can't look at it like from like an ableist perspective either. Not everyone can like drive a car or jump on a bike to come down to the front. Some people need a little, more help. And I think there's extremely limited bus service to and from the train station, public transportation. So I think that would be a key element in this plan, is access and sort of like a general access transportation wise. So long story short, yes, I would think finding ways to expand multi-use sections down there is a definite must already, but definitely now, given what we're dealing with.
Thank you.
That's great. I want to bring somebody else in. I know that we have a few board members that I think have no problem speaking up, and we have a few that maybe we haven't gotten as much feedback from. I'm going to ask Sheila. I know you represent a few different communities in Austin. The library is one, and I know you've been involved with some community activism through Community Voices Heard. So I'm curious, what's your opinion about development on the waterfront? What do you think that you would like to see? What are you hearing from your community about what you'd like to see out there?
Well, I totally agree with. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I totally agree with Melissa on the shuttle transportation. That's a good idea. The waterfront, I would like to see more. I don't know how much space we have, but more storefronts, more recreational things near the waterfront, because it's a absolutely perfect area. And I just want to also put in, I don't know if this has, be near the waterfront, because I had a worker of mine at the library. What did he think would be also something that could bring revenues and money into the city and create jobs? And we both decided that I just want to bring this up. something like, I don't know where we could build this or if it is even possible, but maybe like a raceway or a racetrack. Could that be,
We're losing you there. Hello?
hello?
Oh, yeah. Okay, you're back.
Hi, Sheila.
Okay, it could bring in money into the community and it could create jobs, and it definitely would bring in the right clientele, a racetrack or something like that. I just wanted to bring, because that came from, with me, another resident in Ossining, and I just wanted to put it out there, but I think that area, the waterfront, could be more storefronts. Would probably work.
I think we've lost Sheila.
Yeah, I think she.
So, all right. So I'm gonna wait till she shows back to the participants. I want to pass it over Pat Yost. I know that we spoke the other day for some length of time. Maybe you want to provide a little bit of feedback, because you did seem to have quite a few ideas. You've been around the village, I know, for over 20 years, and I'm interested in hearing what you have to say.
Yeah, so appreciate it. First of all, I've been listening since the start. I've been driving. Sorry I was late in getting into the video portion of the Zoom piece here. But so one, I just want to appreciate all the requests for input, and I also appreciate the concept of doing some more meetings and some more like quick conversations in between just to keep the engagement going. I personally think that that's a great way to just drive discussion and drive ideation, as opposed to kind of like specific kind of once a month sort of thing. So I'm a fan of that. So I just want to say thanks for that. All right. As far as the waterfront specific goes, I think fundamentally for me, I think the chapter is headed in generally the right direction, right? I think that for me, I think the waterfront is just one of the many assets that the village has. And I personally believe that the whole area is currently underutilized, right? So for me, I view the waterfront area pretty much as it's defined in the chapter, which is everything from, that the area formerly known from where Krabucky comes in up north all the way down south. I'd love to see somehow get a way to work with MTA to get something over, back to the Sparta area down there. But I think that's, for me, that's a secondary desire, quite honestly. I'd love to see, a focus on sort of a mixed use combined development of the properties down in the waterfront. For me, I think that does things in multiple ways. One, working in conjunction with the town and the property that they have down there. I think that there's a lot of opportunity to increase access for everybody down there in a way that gets people, down to the waterfront and uses some of the resources. At a minimum, enjoy what's bluntly one of the most beautiful places on the East Coast, if not the U.S. Right? I mean, people post pictures from the waterfront all the time and the sunsets, and I think it's just fantastic, right? But I also think that there's, when you look at some of the previous chapters around what's developable space within the village, I think with the right kind of incentives and the right kind of focus, that there actually is a fair amount of space down there that can be developed to raise, combination of mixed-use developments. I noticed there was some specific mentions of putting some arts facilities down there to draw people down there. Use that as a feeder for potentially some dining establishments, things like that. I think that's a fantastic idea. I also think that, you know, having some mixed use down there to increase ratables, increase the revenue coming in, and spread it out and increase the total revenue coming in, I think is huge. To some of what Frank was talking about related to COVID, you know, for me, I think it's much more of a longer term focus in addition to the COVID piece, but the sustainability question of, you know, having a clear direction of how we as a village want to work with the town, work with the different government agencies to mitigate the reality of the rising river and the rising floodplain, and, you know, coherent plan on that, I think is, you know, spot on. And I think the third thing for me there is, and it was kind of mentioned in the document, but, you know, the more I think about it, there are two more things, sorry. Forgive me if anyone's got questions, jump in, right, and wants to stop me. You know, there's a lot of space taken up with parking lots down there that I think could be consolidated and free up a lot more space for development, and development in a way that's sustainable, and, you know, that this group decides, you know, from a vision perspective, what kind of development do we want? So personally, I'm a fan of that. And for me, my vision is some sort of a ability to circulate down there on both sides of the river, on both sides of the train tracks, excuse me, with easy access, walkable from the north end to the south end and back and forth across the train tracks, to take advantage of, you know, neat things to do, both right on the waterfront and potentially on the east side of the train tracks, with, you know, things that leverage the waterfront, things that leverage arts, things that are mixed use developments, which I think for me, I would love to see a long-term construct which, you know, enables that sort of a, you know, thoughtful, sustainable, you know, accessible to all development, right? So for me, that's my perspective down there.
So, you know, I want to propose something real fast to the group. One of the things that we've been talking about internally is about coming up with some strategies that may reallocate some of the uses down on the waterfront. One of them being maybe adding a little more green space to the west of the train tracks, and a little more, you know, volume of parking on single sites on the east side, which allows for a lot of, you know, changes. I think, you know, one of the things that's notable about the waterfront is that there aren't a lot of like intense uses. Most of the uses that you do have are either surface parking lots, you know, 1-story buildings, maybe 2-story buildings, with the exception of Harbor Square being the obvious, you know, difference. There's just not a lot of really intense uses. So one of the things you mentioned, Pat, was that the concern about, you know, maybe it's not the highest and best use, maybe it's just, it's really underdeveloped. Is that something that that the committee agrees on, that it is sort of underdeveloped and needs to be a higher scale of development and more going on there? And that's not necessarily a clear direction of whether it's going to be residential or this or that or the other, but is the scale something that you think that the community would support a higher intensity of scale right at the train station in particular?
So may I just pitch in one minute before anybody else answers that question? No, thank you, Jaime, for that. I just want to kind of go back a little bit on what we are looking right now. And I think one of the things that for me, and I think for the members of the community, even for the members of this committee right now, it'd be helpful to have, because we talk about waterfront a lot, and that's where we are actually focusing for the past hour so far. What is the waterfront? In reality, the waterfront, it extends more than just where the train station is, more than what that little section that we think that's just the waterfront. The waterfront actually goes, you know, from, you know, south to north. And Pat actually brought up, he kind of touched a little bit on what, you know, the lower part of the spotter, because that also is considered part of the waterfront. So to me, if you look at our zoning map, what are the sections on the zoning map? What are the zones right now that we have on our waterfront that are essential for us to make a decision and what could be developed there? In 2009, the plan, when the comp plan passed through, one of the sections that used to be commercial, it became a single residential zone. And that became in several different occasions for the zoning board perspective, and even from the planning board, and even parts that it came from in front of the village board as issues where it actually was a specific building that was zone office space, and now it was zone residential. So I think we have to look beyond just Metro North area, train station area, and actually start looking the definitions of what the waterfront and what sections on the waterfront we have. Are we talking about the RDD zone? Are we talking about part of the PWB zone? We have all these zones that are part of or sections of the zone that actually belong to the waterfront area. So what are we developing? What are we looking into to actually confine or make changes? Because this is the time for us to make changes or to make modifications in any of these areas at this point. So I think, we had, part of the description, Frank, the document that was sent out to us in regards to the waterfront, it says existing conditions. And you describe what, some of the elements that are there, but there's no really a definition where it says there are sections that are industrial, there are sections that are residential, there are sections that are, multi-purpose use, and even one of the sections that we have in there, it says, yes, we have to have storefronts on the bottom, but does the storefront on the bottom kind of work with that area? Do we need more residential there instead? Do we have to have more commercial spaces in other areas? Do we have to have light industrials in different areas depending on, the landscape of what we have? So I think we as a committee, we need to kind of go back and look what our existing zones are and kind of make, recommendations to our consultants and make, get some feedback from the public as well and see what that entails.
No, that'd be very helpful. Because you have, by the way, we did not get into it as much as we perhaps can. One reason is that the zoning, if we understand that after the 2009 plan, it recommended quite a bit of zoning on the waterfront, and that actually, historically, the board of trustees adopted much of the 2009 zoning. So you're raising a very good question, is that 2009 zoning, though relatively, compared to other parts of the code, relatively new, is it going to represent what you really want on the waterfront? And if not, and I think that may be part of Jaime's question too, if not, should we be looking at some changes to it?
Could I say something in respect to this waterfront before we even think about what to build there? It seems to me that it is a part of our village that is most urgently at risk of environmental calamities. 100-year flood zone plans I see there, maybe we don't even know at the moment whether they are accurate or whether it's actually going to get worse within 100 years as it is projected now. I'm leaning towards the fact that we still look in terms of climate change at relatively conservative figures. But it does mean that we as a community need to decide that whatever we're going to develop there, if it is subject to an environmental calamity, flooding, that we as community are not being saddled up with having to remediate or evacuate endless numbers of people because of the fact that conditions become untenable. So we should really develop activities or land use in such a way with this threat of flooding in the back of our mind, that if it does happen, that nothing much is going amiss, and that whatever we do is actually able to absorb things like flooding, unless we're going to build dikes. I was born in Holland. Half of my country is protected by dikes, and if that didn't happen, I wouldn't actually sit here, because I grew up in a place that is 3 meters under water level. And here we are clearly not doing that sort of reinforcement of the land. Metro North as an regional transport organization is not even having anything on the books to do something about flooding. So it really falls down on our own, on this community to deal with that if things run out of hand. So to cover ourselves with that, we should plan for things and activities in that low risk land, or high risk lowland rather, that if something runs out of hand, that we actually can deal with that without having to fork out untold tax dollars, for that matter, to remediate it.
So this brings up actually a good point, and it might be a good segue for Simon and Frank to kind of weigh in a little bit on this. I think in response to sort of what they've been seeing on the ground and what they've seen in other communities, what they've been looking at is really whether or not there's the ability to do adaptive design, which essentially allows you to build buildings and still do kind of a more robust economic development plan, but that would, on the lower floors, allow for some level of water to enter the site in the event of some flooding. And so I think, Frank, what you're bringing up is sort of the Frank Budding, I should say, what you're doing, the decision that the Village of Ossining really needs to make about whether or not they want to sort of step away from the land and stop building on it entirely, which comes at one economic cost. Whether you want to build and do it in a way that sort of has adaptive design that allows you to build up on the waterfront, or whether you want to sort of meet somewhere in the middle where you're sort of getting a little bit away, but you're still building up close to the train station. And I think that that's something that's sort of important. And so, Simon, maybe you and Frank can talk a little bit about some of the adaptive design that has worked in other communities and might be appropriate here.
Well, I would start just by saying that, some of what Pat talked about in terms of the waterfront being an asset and in some cases being underutilized, and what Frank just talked about in terms of the need to acknowledge this reality that we all know is coming, climate change and sea level rise, and it's going to impact all these parcels down there. On the slide that I had up before, that is exactly the balance that we feel like we need to strike in this chapter. There are, my hunch that, correct us if we're wrong on this, right? But my hunch is that there are relatively few sites on the waterfront where the village would say, let's retreat. There are buildings here. Our future plan is to not have buildings on these sites in the future, right? What that means is that we need a plan. The village needs a plan for, as Frank said, are there some sites that are particularly at high risk? The site where the oil tanks are located, for example, where you need to think about those in terms of, as land use changes, what's the right thing there? Is it another multifamily development? It might not be. Are there other sites, in particular on the east side of the tracks, where there is development now? In some cases, it might not be the highest and best use, but there are buildings there. And so what does that mean? What are the ways that the village can start thinking about protecting buildings that are built, but also putting code in place, flood mitigation design guidelines, so that as buildings are renovated or new buildings are built, it's done in a way that it's both protecting people and businesses who are living and working there, but also still protecting the street life and making sure that it remains a walkable and lively community. That's the balance that we're trying to strike. That's at a high level. Now the devil's in the details. But but it's, you know, it's, you know, from a big picture standpoint, that's what we're trying to achieve on these sites down here.
I would just add there, Jaime, that we put in, I think a suggestion was made to us, you know, some just sidebars in the chapter from other communities. And I think one thing I would mention that might be a balance, although Metro North has no plans for it, but something that Frank B. raised, and that is evacuation. If you had another Sandy, Simon used the example of the oil tanks being replaced by what? Let's say as a hypothetical. I might go a little further. You might not want multifamily housing in that location. In terms of sustainability and in terms of flooding, you might want to see the more intense development on the east side of the tracks, not on the west side, because the west side is if you get a congestion or a breakdown or whatever at one of the very few access points you have to the waterfront, then I think you could be in trouble. So I think there's a balance between access to the waterfront, open space, the ferries, ability, the things that you've mentioned. But I think it may be sensible to stress a little bit the sustainability idea as Beacon has. The Beacon basically is not going to allow the old development plans they had for a hotel and very dense housing on the west side of their tracks because of what happened at Sandy. And so that's why I was very curious what Metro North had any plans at all. They have none. But eventually, Metro North is a huge agency. It's just totally preoccupied right now because of the pandemic that they've gone through and trying to get ridership back. But eventually, I think it may make some sense to use the tracks as sort of a, not a point where you say, oh, nothing happens on this side and everything happens on the other, but to be careful what happens west of the tracks, not only for evacuation, but just for the severity of flooding. In other words, emphasize open space, parks, ball fields, the type of development, or even the museum at Sing Sing, the type of things that can be easily evacuated or evacuated on notice. The oil tanks in the immediate future can be protected, of course, and are by berm around it. But I think there might be a geographic distinction of the train tracks, which could fit into this. It's just something to pick up on what Frank B. said.
I'd like to add a little bit here. I'd like to add 3 quick things. Number 1, I'm going to call BS on Metro North. It's a big agency. They can get one person to be thinking about climate change with respect to their entire system. I have total respect for what they're going through right now with respect to trying to stay open, COVID, all that. Totally, I see 99% of their energy going toward that. But if we have learned anything from COVID, it's that there are some foreseeable issues that we can be taking mitigating steps now to making our life easier when it hits. We know that, and we know climate change is coming. They could put one person on it. So, okay, I'm just gonna put that out there. Number 2, when it comes to the waterfront specifically, I think the way that it's laid out, and if you look at the waterfront chapter that you all have drafted so far, it's pretty clear to me. There is not really like one big thing that we can do. Aside from, you take the DPW site, for example, building that up. There are some kind of key pieces like that that you can start to build up, but there isn't necessarily the space, just given the constraints that there is, to do one big flashpoint thing. And even if you did do that, given the constraints that are there with parking and everything else, if you just look at the people that are using the waterfront now due to COVID, many more people using it now because they don't have the opportunity to go to other places, and issues with garbage and enforcement of rules and whatever else. There's issues along the way. All that is to say, I think the play, and again, this is just me talking, but I think the play is you take, for example, a big shout out to Deputy Village. Is it Maddie? What is your? It's super. I want to say supervisor. Super. What is it?
Supervisor?
You're talking about the town supervisor? I don't know where you're going.
No, not the town supervisor. No, village manager. Got it. So Maddie, the deputy village manager. I'm like, I have all these terms in my head. Did a fantastic job with getting Bigfoot Creamery into getting first getting the RFP out and then getting Bigfoot Creamery there. And like the quality of life that has added for the ability to go to the waterfront, you play in the playground, you go for a walk, you grab some ice cream. I think that's the play. What seemed to be relatively within the scale of the entire waterfront. I think Mandy brought up a very smart point of that it is a big waterfront, but in terms of like what you can actually do, relatively small but very important steps of advancing the waterfront. That's really what you're looking for in terms of adding quality of life to the waterfront, as opposed to kind of like one big thing, because it's not really like that. To me, like Crawbucky, that's a place that we should be putting a lot of energy into making Crawbucky something that let's go to Crawbucky, I'm making it a destination, something like that. And number three, there are, generally speaking, when you're having group discussions like this about ideas, two kinds of conversations that you can have. A divergent conversation and a convergent conversation. A divergent conversation is when you start from a point and you diverge from that point. So you start from like, what could the waterfront be? Let's imagine all the things it could be. And it's all the things that we have discussed. What about climate change? What about a racetrack? What about this? What about that? What about it? And those kinds of conversations are important, and they're one kind of conversation. But they can also go out for an unlimited amount of time. Then there are convergent conversations where you have a lot of ideas and you're trying to converge them to a single point to say like, how do we distill this into something that is actionable? And I think one of the challenges is that we have both convergent and divergent conversations at the same time. So my push would be to say, if we're going to have a divergent conversation, put a time limit to say, okay, for the next 15 minutes, let's just throw all the ideas out there that we have and then see what we have and then stop at 15 minutes. And if the ideas are still rolling, we'll add another 10 or 15 or whatever. But if we say like, okay, like if we're having a convergent conversation, we need to come up with like 3 solid recommendations that we want to put in the thing. Already in the chapter, there are a set of recommendations. Which of these speak to you, which don't? The point is that you're trying to like get to a specific outcome. So I would push the prompt one way or another, because I'm just looking at the time. It is 8:12. It is 8:13. It just turned 8:13. And the fact of the matter is we haven't talked about downtown at all. And trust me, I got opinions. And so this is going to go until midnight if we're just going to keep going forever. So that would be my push, to frame the conversation about whether, if it's big ideas, great, make it time limited. If it's not, then be specific about what the outcome should be.
All right, so if I can maybe do one quick convergent discussion, and this maybe just requires thumbs up. I'd like to propose putting together that walk around the waterfront together. Are there thumbs ups from the board members? All right, I will work with BFJ and we'll get that set up.
Thank you, Jaime.
And I think with what Omar said, I think we can probably move on to the next.
Okay.
Just one more thing, and just kind of goes back to what Frank D was talking about early today, and it's about the flooding mitigation, and that's what Frank F was talking about before. And I believe, Karen, please correct me if I'm wrong. We do have this. Obviously, it was mentioned the Cornell study and the students that they did all the stuff. There's a group of us that have been meeting with them and the CAT study itself. And I believe either Simon or Frank, or are you guys going to be able to be there next week?
So I just want to be clear though, it's a Cornell Adaptive Design Studio. So we had architectural landscape architects from Cornell, graduate students, did climate mitigation design. So they did a whole range of different scenarios and different types of designs for the waterfront that really spanned the town and village parcels on the east side of the tracks, and some things like some innovative things that maybe if MTA ever decides to look at it, they can look at their designs, because there was submerged trains, there was flying trains, there was trains that moved, like it was a lot of stuff going on. But they'll be we'll be meeting with them because they put together a lookbook as the final project. The study part though, which has to do with the maps and what they use, is they used, I forget what source that they used, but the maps, there's a couple of different sources that, you know, take into consideration tidal surges and other things into climate change and what it might be like. Some are perceived as being more realistic than, you know, than others, but those exist sort of separately. We are going to be meeting with them to hear about the final project and the lookbook, and I do want to invite BFJ to participate in that call. It's going to be on the 29th. Maddie, I don't remember what time.
Yep, we asked that Simon be included when the invite goes out, so it's early afternoon on the 29th.
So, you know, well, that was a project that the town and village did. So this is them reporting back to the supervisor's office and the village. And then we'll be able to share that information with the group too. What's nice is that it gave some visual context to floodplain maps and some innovative ideas of what could happen in recreation space and other things down at the waterfront. And it really spoke to what could be designed that would either mitigate or be resistant and resilient to sea level rise and flooding.
Yeah, you know, I'm gonna this topic that you're talking about here is like super complicated, and me and Simon, I think, have already spent about an hour and a half on the phone talking about the various differences between, you know, sea level rise and this. So I'm going to propose, can we do a study hall that focuses specifically on the types of data? Because that might be something where we can send out a few different things and talk about it, and it can be sort of a for those who are interested in finding out more about the finer details. We could talk about that maybe at a more convenient time. Because there's the Columbia data is not all that different from all the data that comes from FEMA versus the data, because we're looking at different data sets. There's FEMA flood maps, and there's sea level rise projections, and there's median, and there's extreme, and there's low level, and they're, you know, based off of starting at 1992 versus starting at 2020.
Storm surges.
It's very complicated. We could spend the next 5 hours talking about it. So are people interested in having like a little study group about that? Would that be thumbs up? All right. Putting that on the notes.
But Manny, yes, to your question, we're looking forward to attending that meeting next week.
That'll be great. Thank you.
Great.
Okay, so should we dive into the downtown and economic development content? Great.
Okay.
Okay, so I'll just reiterate a couple of points before I get started. Number one, as I go through these, a lot of these slides have questions written out on them, and they're there to stimulate discussion. So so if any of you have any thoughts along the way, please interrupt me. But also, you know, just like the conversation that we just had on the waterfront, I think if we can do a study hall on this in the next, you know, maybe in the next few weeks before the next committee meeting, that would be helpful as well. If we get started on this and we don't have time to get into everything, but what we wanted to start with here is what's the sort of high level goal? What are we trying to achieve? And that's in that bit of text here. We're looking at trying to strengthen the local economy, make downtown become more of an attraction, like some other villages in Westchester have become, to help expand the tax base. And what does that require? What do you need in order to do that? What do you need to provide? That'll help diversify the economy. And also, it's not just about attracting residents, and it's not just about what kinds of storefronts do you want to see. It's not just about tourism. All of these things are rolled up together, and a lot of them have similar sort of similar demand, similar assets that would help there. And then a few kind of bullet points here. Are there other things that we're trying to think about? What are the assets? What are the trends that we need to respond to? In particular, in the context of COVID-19, what are the attractions that we can build upon? And then we're also looking at a couple of different geographical areas. It's not just the downtown. It's also the corridors that people travel on to enter Upper Croton and Route 9 and neighborhood commercial nodes. So that's an important just thing for everyone to keep in the back of our minds. Downtown is a big part of Ossing's economic development, but it's not all of it. So we don't want to limit this discussion just to the downtown. So a couple of existing conditions that we looked at. This is really just highlighting these different corridors and nodes. And the one thing I wanted to point out here, give me a moment, I'll turn on my laser pointer, is that right here in the downtown, more so than in some of the other areas, than on Croton Avenue and Route 9, South Highland, and so on. There is quite a bit of vacant land that's village owned or that's private owned, and also land that's being used for transportation and parking. And so what that says to me, and I think Jonathan talked about this a little bit in the land use and zoning presentation a couple of months ago, is that there are some opportunities here in the downtown where there's vacant land that's owned by the village, where there are surface parking lots that are owned by the village. Those are, those are parcels that you could decide, look, we like how they're being used, we want them to remain like that. But because they're owned by the village, it also gives you, some control and it gives you some opportunities to build upon that. So there's some crossover here in terms of the material that Jonathan talked about in terms of land use and highest and best use, and also economic development. And so that's something that's always in the back of our mind, is how these different issues can build upon each other. Another thing that we looked at is digging into some of the data, sort of employment changes over time. And one thing that I want to highlight here is that, and I'm looking at 2000 versus 2018. The reason I looked at 2000 is because that's the data set that the 2009 plan looked at. So this sort of gives us a comparison between what you all were looking at in 2009 versus what we're looking at now. The one industry that saw a major change in terms of employment over the last 18 years is construction, which went from less than 9% of employed workers in the village to nearly 16%. Everything else, there are some changes, but nothing major. It's a percentage or 2% here or there. And the other thing I wanted to highlight is your sort of largest industry sector, which has not changed from 2000 until now. It's been about 24%, is educational, health, and social services. So that's a couple of data points that popped out to us. And then your major employers, you probably all know, Sing Sing, the school district, and a couple of major businesses.
Simon?
Yes.
I just want to add, I think that we're a little even larger on that, because Open Doors, at least 150 people in Ossining alone. So they probably should be on that major employers list, but they would go under that same sector.
Oh, great. So Karen, thank you for pointing that out. It's one thing that's worth saying on this major employers data. It's from Esri, which is a reliable data source, but this particular data point tends to be very buggy. So it's part of why I have specific numbers here, because I'm not 100% sure that they're accurate. But Open Door, that's a great point. That's another major employer that we should add. We should add here. Thank you for that. Then another thing, and this is actually quite typical, as you might expect, in Westchester. But see here, oops, that Ossining is it's currently anyway essentially a bedroom community, right? You've got a large number who live in Ossining and work elsewhere. A large portion in New York City, a relatively small number that both live and work in Ossining, and some who live elsewhere and commute in, but not as many as who live in Ossining and work elsewhere. I want to keep these numbers in your mind as we go through this. I want to talk about this a little bit more when we get to the slide about response to COVID and sort of changing national trends about where people work and working from home and that sort of thing. It's an important important thing to keep in mind. Typically when we've talked about data points like this in Westchester communities in the past, we've had communities say, well, should we try to fix this? Should we have more people who live and work, here in our community? Historically, it's not really been a problem. It's actually part of what makes a lot of Westchester communities strong is that you're near a major employment hub. However, in this day and age, you might think about this starting to change in a way that you haven't in the past. You might think about wanting to keep more of your workforce local, fewer people traveling to other parts of the region, and trying to keep some of that spending power in the daytime locally. You may not need that. You may not think you need that, but it's just one of the factors that that you may think about differently now in this age of COVID and people's greater ability to work from home than that you may not have thought about so much in the past. The other thing that we looked at in terms of existing conditions are some recent plans and studies about economic development and development generally in the downtown and in other areas. The most recent one is your DRI application from last year. We've had an opportunity to work on 5 DRI plans over the course of the last 4 years. So we've gotten a bit of experience on these. And so, looking at your DRI application from last year, what jumped out at me were 3 major capital projects that the village looked at as transformative opportunities. It was 200 Main Street, restructuring the parking in Market Square and the post office lot in the downtown, potentially considering a structure there, and doing some placemaking streetscape improvements down in Station Plaza. I want to pause on this slide for a moment, and I want to ask all of you, looking at these 3 opportunities and whether you think these are the right moves or more importantly, are there others? The way I think about this in the context of DRI is, what's your wish list? This is not a question of necessarily what is the village's, what's in the village's capital budget, but if you were able to get a grant, in this case, $10 million from New York State, what would be on your wish list? How would you want to sort of prioritize spending it? So who wants to jump in on that? I know I've got there's some questions here. It looks like someone's answering. It's good. Okay. Anyone in the steering committee want to jump in on this? What's your wish list? Where would you spend money if you got grant funding to help the economy?
Hey Jeff, you're going to be spending a lot more time down there in Market Square, probably, and so you're also on the planning board. Maybe you want to give your opinion.
Yeah, one of the things that, and I know the next slide is about the downtown revitalization on that committee. But I think one of the areas that we really thought we could improve as a community was the streetscape under this, under the rubric of placemaking. There was also a lot of voices in that group that were really concerned about Route 9. And if you look at Route 9 as it goes south through Sleepy Hollow or Tarrytown, it's one lane in each direction, and it has a really different character in terms of the community feel, the way people are comfortable walking around on Route 9. Route 9 being a place for storefronts and restaurants to kind of open up and interact with the community. And when it goes through Ossining, it goes out, it fans out, so it's 2 lanes in each direction. And I think just in general, it's a less hospitable place for pedestrians and cyclists. And so what could we do with that money to like reimagine and really create beautiful places that are for pedestrians and cyclists and open spaces? If you go to the intersection of Croton Ave and Route 9, you can't throw a stone from one side to the other. It's just a great expanse of pavement that's there for cars. And so what are ways that you could, if you change the configuration for traffic, actually create new places for either pedestrians or different types of plazas or green spaces. So that was one of the, the ideas that we kept, pitching around. And, I think that that's a place that could, going in a direction like that could really change the feel of downtown for pedestrians and shops and, being a way to generate economic development.
Great. Yeah, that's a great example. Yeah, thank you for that, Jeff.
Jeff, if I could mention just on that, because it draws a slight complication to it. As you know, the state, it's a state road. And so once you say to the state, we're going to do away with a lane in each direction, they're going to have to, that's the only way you can do that, what you just described. In Carytown, where we did their plan, you're right that Tarrytown has a much different feel. But what Tarrytown, the price of doing a Tarrytown in Ossining is constant congestion with cars, constant. That's what Tarrytown has now. To the extent that we represented Tarrytown, this is hard to say because we also did Sleepy Hollow's comprehensive plan, so it was a little sensitive. Tarrytown actually sued Sleepy Hollow over the project on the waterfront, the old General Motors site, now called the Edge. And the reason was that it was going to add even more traffic to Route 9 with no solution to that traffic, and it would make Tarrytown even more congested. So what I'm pointing out here is just that there's a price to making it more walkable. It also becomes more congested. So you have to balance the two. I'm not saying how you should come out on that balance. You may want to come out on that balance, in the Tarrytown direction.
And there are other people in the community who know more about this than me, but I understand that there were meetings with the state that took place years ago with the Department of Transportation, and that also there are ways of doing traffic configurations using different technologies or, carefully planning turning lanes and places, to avoid congestion. And that actually one of the sources of congestion was the fact that when you go out to 4 lanes, eventually you have to come back down to 2 lanes. So it's around like Maurice, or I forget which, somewhere one of those streets is where there's always a bottleneck of cars coming back together, and that's a source of congestion as well. So I think that idea should at least be explored. There may be ways to do it to kind of get the best of both worlds, or to deal with increased volume of traffic on 2 lanes in each direction, and avoid backups. But it's something that a lot of people felt strongly on that committee. And I
agree, by the way. As my partner would say, my traffic partner, congestion is sometimes a sign of success and a nice place that attracts people. So,
there's no traffic to a place nobody wants to go to.
That's right. That's right.
So, I think that it's your suggestion is really a very interesting one, and I think certainly one that we need to think about thoughtfully.
Yes, absolutely. The other one I think you're going to have to think about thoughtfully too is what we've listed here is obviously your village-owned properties, which are currently parking lots. How you do that, how those sites are developed, and what do you do with the parking? How do you replace it? How do you make sure that the shopper is still attracted to downtown and can find parking?
Yeah, I wanna mention something. There's some work that we've been doing out on the side, kind of looking at the valuation of the underlying property. And so, this is some food for thought, and maybe we can get some comments from the steering committee on this. But one of the things that we found is that the land obviously is very valuable in the downtown or in and around the Market Square area. And a lot of it currently, even though it's highly valuable, is being used as a surface parking lot. So if you look at the parking issue, one as a sort of a volume issue and saying we need a certain amount of volume rather than a certain amount of space, and think about the parking as potentially coming in as three-dimensional if there was a second story parking lot somewhere that could add additional volume, but would allow, the change of use from being a surface parking lot to being something else. There is a lot of room to grow. And so I'm curious, what, if those were, deals that were possible, would people in the village like to see more development in the downtown as long as it didn't come at the cost of some of the parking volume that currently exists? Or is parking really just kind of the key issue and everything else falls behind it? What's everybody's sense?
I have in the past remarked that we should be looking at tax mapping for the village to see where our highest points of revenues are, to see how we actually can and base our development plans on those figures rather than to say where would you like to see this, that, and the other thing. But I haven't heard any feedback on this whole tax mapping issue.
Yeah, I mean, some of the stuff that we're working on right now is directly related to trying to figure out that underlying value of land. That's part of why this question is being asked, Frank. It's a direct response to sort of the suggestions that you sent over about the sort of the strong town stuff, but trying to get a better sense of it. So we're looking into that as well. I know that Urbanomics is doing it, but I'm trying to get a broader sense of what people's feelings are around the sort of the density in the downtown and the use of those parking lots and kind of turning them into something else. I think that's sort of the heart of what, Frank and Simon are trying to get to here, is the potential for redevelopment around some of those publicly owned parking lots. And that's the parking restructuring here that you see on the second item, right? So
this is Pat. I'll put a few thoughts out there. So I think that there is a certain the restructuring, and I think the appropriate development to me go hand in hand, especially in that center part of the Crescent area, right? And I believe, even so for me, I love the way that the space at the corner of Spring and Main is used for gatherings, for conversations, for concerts, for the open air farmers market, and I think that that's a great draw to the area. So for me, anything needs to continue to provide that kind of a space, right? So as I've thought about it, I believe there actually used to be a building at the corner of Spring and Main where that market is right now. I think that used to be the hardware store, because I think I owned the house of the guy who owned the hardware store. There was a picture of their house at one point.
Yeah.
And so, there's, for me, the way I think about that corner there in the downtown is if you free up parking space a little bit off the main drag, like Brandeth or something like that, or somewhere else, you can put a gathering spot in the parking lot at the post office, and potentially put the buildings that used to be there back at the corner of Spring and Main. So that kind of sort of sequential development for me, which meets multiple needs in terms of frees up space, potentially frees up a lot of space on the street to make it much more walkable, much more accessible for bikes, but still provides that what I feel is very important social gathering space for people to get together, to have music, to do the like the awareness, I don't want to call it a rally, but the awareness, the gatherings, that were going on the last few weeks, which I think need to continue to have a space for that. You know, so for me, I think they go hand in hand personally.
Yeah.
I think there's definitely a need for some type of multi-level parking structure, because I just don't see how you would expand anything in that area and not expect the parking to be congested. I think right now, a majority of the parking is taken up by the employees of these businesses, especially Open Door. I know their employees take up a lot of the parking around the area, especially the one in the back by Brandon, and even sometimes up and down Maple Avenue. So I think a multi-level parking structure in some regard would be absolutely needed, and it would also, as just pointed out, provide volume without necessarily taking up more space. Really quickly to this whole conversation, I think someone threw out the word wish list or something like that. I would propose, especially seeing that slide that indicates that we have upwards of almost 3,000 people who are coming from out of Ossining working here, and we have about 8,000 going out of Ossining to work here. I think we need to start considering, when we're talking about all this revitalization and building, how we provide opportunities for our residents to be part of that process as far as job opportunities go. Because I think that will also fuel the economy, and it will also, here in Ossining, and it would also kind of balance the scale, so to speak, as far as what we're talking about as people working a bit closer to home and, you know, making things more accessible. So I just want to throw that out there when we're thinking of these plans and how we move forward, considering the job opportunities that can be in place for the residents here as well. And I think that in and of itself will help fuel the economy here as well.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Melissa. Okay. Hey, I'm gonna. This is good. I'm gonna jump a couple of slides ahead, just because I think that Jeff touched on this slide a little bit, the Downtown Working Committee report. And the next one here is a Market Square study. It's a little bit older, but it's just 5 years old. It was a survey that the village did online, and really focused in on the sites here on the right side of the screen here. We've talked about them a little bit. But what I wanted to zero in on here for discussion is what's in yellow down here at the bottom. In this survey, there was a pretty clear preference. The survey asked, you know, what height of building would you like to see in downtown? And there was a clear preference for 3 to 4 story buildings. However, and this is for discussion, what the question didn't get at is whether there's some kind of trade-off, because the survey also found what we've heard here tonight from all of you, which is that there's a need for more public parking, and there's a need to attract private investment. And so what I was wondering when I was thinking about how this study from back in 2015 still resonates is, how would folks in the village think about that trade-off? Is 3 to 4 stories the cap no matter what? Or, at least from all of you, would you be open to something taller than that if it's providing the public parking that we recognize the downtown needs, if it's attracting private investment that may not otherwise come? If those are the factors that you have to balance, would you be willing to go beyond?
Yeah, and I think it's worth noting that, as you know, just as you're marinating on that a little bit, I think it's worth noting that, one of the things that you see in this map, or really one of the things that you don't see in this map, is that there is other parking sort of a little bit, off this, about a block away north and a block south. And so if you're talking about increasing, more parking volume in this area, that's part of the problem. But one of the big comments that comes up is historic nature of, the sort of north side of Main Street. There are ways of sort of looking at the zoning in some of these other areas differently than you look at the historic. So if there's a concern about preserving some of the history that you have on one side of the street, that can, sort of be held in regard at the same time where you're looking at maybe increasing the height of properties across the street. So those don't work in opposition to each other. And I think that sometimes people worry that, oh, if you're going to let people build on this side, it's going to sort of take away from what's going on the other side of the street, or it's going to put additional pressure on the other side of the street. And that's not necessarily the case. That's stuff that can be sort of worked into, you know, these plans over time, especially when you're talking about going up, you know, 4 stories and then setting back a little bit and going up to a point where you don't even notice some of those higher stories. So there's a lot that can be done there. So with that in mind, you please, you know, if you could answer Simon's question, which I think is a super relevant question to this process.
I think one of the problems with this study, and if I remember, there were other images in the study that showed the massing of buildings and how you would, what the density that each of these sites could hold is. If you ask someone, are you okay with 3 or 4 stories or 5 or 6 stories, that kind of just does, out of context, that doesn't really mean anything. And I think that when people looked at that study, when they looked at those images that were supposed to just be like graphical representations of the type of density, they imagined, oh, that's what you want to build there. And and I think that I know, like with, for example, in the proposed Waterfront chapter, there was like 1 page of images of other communities that, you know, could sort of like be an ideas page. And I think that just the question 3 or 4 stories, is that okay, is just so lacking any other of the you know, things we want as a community, like preserving the historic nature or
no nuance in the question.
What's that?
No real nuance in the question.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be okay with 3 or 4 or 5 or maybe 5 or 6. It just asking the question that way, I think it's like maybe what do we want as a community? What types of things could go there to increase or enhance the experiences we're already having? Maybe we want density because we want to increase foot traffic to local businesses. So, but that's a way of looking at the question as opposed to like how many stories, 3 or 4, or 5, you know, could it be 5 or, you know, that's just sort of my thought about the way, like approaching the question from that way.
I think that's a great point, Jeff. If the discussion is more about what do people want to see in the downtown rather than how tall the buildings are, it opens up a conversation about how to make it happen rather than just focusing on massing of buildings.
Yeah, I think though we also have to focus a little bit on the marketplace. There's also what we've perceived in the recent years, I think you're all aware of it, is there's a shrinking market for retail, and there's an increased market in many of Westchester's downtowns now for residential. So in terms of uses, the ability to get a good mix of residential downtown would be important to support retail, which is under, you know, pressure from people like Amazon and just changing shopping trends. So looking at the land use and making sure that it's marketable would be important to success in downtown.
So I do think that on the related parking question, if we're going to talk about a parking structure so that we net more parking spaces, whatever we do, because right now we have a bunch of spread out parking lots, that's going to cost money. So if we're talking about now a public benefit, how can we potentially leverage development here into creating a parking structure that you know, will ultimately net more parking and reduce some of the parking scarcity issues downtown? Then I think that that's a way of talking about that. And I think we already allow 4-story buildings there anyway. So I think, you know, for some people in the community, it's just a matter of what's that going to look like. Is that going to change views? Is it going to change, you know, the way like the shadows cast in the area? If you're on the street, are you going to be in like the shadow of this large building? So I think that like, if that's what we need to do to kind of leverage some of the public benefits we want to get, then I think we need to just show the community what's that going to look like in the context of what we already have.
Two quick things. Number one, while we're having this discussion, if we could take the screen share off, You just have such beautiful faces. I want to see all of them. That would be great. And number two, my precious colleague, Manny Casada, has been unmuted for many minutes, and I'd love to hear his thoughts. Manny, please.
Thanks, Omar. You know, I was actually listening to Jeff, and he kind of put a lot of things in perspective, run some memories back in 2014 when I was part of the study of those particular sites. And some of the questions or some of the concerns that he raised was some of the concerns that we went through at that time as a village board. One of the things of my recollection, and I hope, I think my best recollection was we did not be too opposed to be something higher than the other side of that district, which just keep in mind that the other side of the district, even though it's in the downtown, is actually a historic site, and they have different rules and regulations in that perspective as well. And one of the things that we, at that time on the board, we wanted to make sure that we complement whatever happened on that side. We wanted to make sure they complement each other. At the bottom at that point, we were looking obviously as a more retail with some sort of setback, so we can make our sidewalk, the sidewalks a little bit wider, so we can provide more outdoor seating and residential on the top. And what you showed in the map, Simon, it was actually 3 different plans, 3 different scenarios. You know, obviously, not only that, but you know, after that study, Jeff, some of the members here may have a different, you know, some recollection. One of the things that we did is also as well is, you know, whatever happens in the downtown, we have to look, you know, one of the recommendations, let me go back a little bit. One of the recommendations that the 2009 comp plan had was make Spring Street a 2-way on that section, you know, going from Waller, I believe, and Main Street. So, which we did, we acted on that point, and we were, right now, we have to look, whatever happens in there, we have to make sure that we reconfigure that whole intersection as well at some point of time. Going from there, I think there's a lot of different elements, and even if you guys, you know, it's a great point that, you know, there was, I can't remember, I think it was Frank or Pat Joyce that did a recommendation in bringing some studies back. You know, I don't know what year, I cannot remember what year was it, but definitely was before I was part of the board. There was actually a study about a parking lot on the rear of where the Open Door building is, and that is a municipal lot. I believe it was a 3-story or a 3-level parking lot. So, you know, so all those elements, I think we have to have, you know, as a review process for us to actually, you know, make some recommendations as well, because there's a lot of things that, you know, that has gone through the site, you know, different developments that, you know, like the other thing that I can recall is, and probably Jeff, you correct me if I'm wrong on this one, is on the study in 2009 was, you know, they wanted to make more changes on a traffic pattern on Central Ave and Main Street, where they were thinking about doing it like a 1-way going up, 1-way coming up, you know, different configuration to relieve some of the traffic that they were seeing or predicting at the time from the train station. And what does that look like, and what does that mean? And I'm kind of going back a little bit in what Jeff brought up on Highland Avenue on Route 9. That has been going on for years. And the DOT pretty much at some point of time kind of, you know, started doing some work and didn't do anything. And I know our village manager's office, Karen and T. Hyman now, some of the members are being pushed, and even Sandy Gallup has been part of those meetings right now, I believe. I'm not sure what the progress there is, but there's something coming up, and hopefully will be something within this year, hopefully early next year in regards to that, because that's a challenge as well. And you know, I think is something to, you know, I think Jaime mentioned there are parking opportunities or parking areas opportunities on State Street, and even part of that, and some areas on Spring Street as well, that we should be looking into as we move forward from this.
Yes.
I saw, with all due respect, Jaime, before you continue, Assistant Village Manager Manny Zahach nodding vigorously at Manny's discussion of the parking. If you could please give that you are the memory of the village, please give a little context there of what you remember about this.
No, so I wasn't around at the time, but I did just want to share. So we actually just added that back to the village website. It's a 2003 study about the parking garage feasibility on Brandreth. So I can send out the link if anybody's curious and taking a look at that as part of this conversation, because we just added it so that folks answering the parking study RFP could peruse that.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if this is the same study, but there's an FP Clark study that was showing parking alternatives as well, that Joe Clark, formerly of the planning board, who is one of the people viewing this right now, mentioned. I think that you know, we're kind of honing in on some really interesting points here, which is helpful for me to understand. In the downtown, I think that you have a couple of different options. You have one option, which I think nobody would go for and nobody agrees with, is you sort of like tear down some of these buildings, you put up some really tall buildings. They might be, you know, more in line with generating a higher amount of revenue, but the impact that it would have in taking away from the historic nature of the downtown might be too much. And on the other hand, you have sort of like augmenting some of the parking stuff and finding different ways to better utilize the parking space to get a little bit more density to help the businesses that are down there. One of the things that we have not really talked about at all that I want to hear from the committee about is the sort of the lack of real sidewalk space for a lot of the area in the downtown. So because of we have some businesses in the downtown that are essentially, you know, barely able to fit on the sidewalk because the sidewalks are so skinny. And if we wanted to encourage more of this sort of nightlife in the downtown, where people could put, you know, in the future, they could have outdoor dining in front of their restaurants. They're really, as far as I can see, only Barlow Block really, you know, sort of lends itself to being something that could be shared by ADA, you know, accessibility, people eating outdoors and everything else. So we have a real absence of available sidewalk. Is that kind of, you know, downtown nightlife something that that people want to see more of? Should we be examining the widths of the sidewalk to better accommodate some of that stuff that you mentioned a moment ago, Manny? You know, getting more sort of restaurants in the downtown that can sort of sit and use space on that sidewalk?
I believe part of the 2009 study was that was one of the reasons, because when they start deviating the one-way streets going from Spring Street and Main Street down to the train station and Central Ave, that was the concept, that was the idea. But I think the challenge is a bigger challenge that we have, because if we deviate and make them wider sidewalks, obviously we're going to be eliminating parking. And if we eliminate parking and we don't have a parking structure to kind of alleviate some of the you know, the traffic part, you know, it's like we're fixing one problem or we're patching one problem to patch something else. So I think we have to, at some point of time, we have to decide is like what comes first. And then with that, we can assess a different portion of this whole scenario. I mean, one of the things that we haven't really talked about this, and something that the assistant village manager is working on it, is she's working on a parking study. So I think that's something that will you know, is a bigger parking study, but I think we can capture the parking study for the downtown area and kind of make that as a reference to what possibilities we could have there. So that's something that we can, you know, definitely have to be on the lookout from Maddie's perspective and get that information from her to share with us and to the community.
Yeah, I mean, without kind of going too deep into the detail, I think a lot, you know, what you're going to get in a study is going to look at the specifics of measuring whether or not you could do this, and then, you know, directly looking at the impact of the volume, directly looking at all of the specific impacts of whatever that proposal is something that goes through that study. I think what the comprehensive plan can do is really talk about whether or not you're supportive of creating wider sidewalks and potentially losing some parking spaces, but adding some parking spaces, and sort of enabling you through the comprehensive process to say, like, you know, the village needs to start taking the next steps as part of the recommendation process. So if that's the case, it's easy, I think, on a certain level as an academic exercise to start visualizing what that looks like in terms of, you know, when they're putting together the form-based plan for the downtown that they're already working on, also looking at, you know, the sidewalk, you know, widths in some of the areas in certain districts when they're figuring out the regulating plans. Is that something that this committee would be interested in seeing? More sidewalk space in and around the downtown?
I'll give you my thought. Oh wait, I'm gonna defer actually first. To Melissa Banta, please, Melissa.
Oh no, just really quickly. I think that that's part of what I was envisioning when I said the multi-level spaces, that you would ultimately be consolidating other parking spaces that exist. So I guess, you know, giving up those storefront parking spaces in lieu of a central area for parking, I guess would be, you know, feasible outcome, because, you know, that's the only way to expand sidewalk space, because a lot of those streets are already very narrow. And, you know, Spring Street particularly, that is now a two-way street, it's very narrow. It's a bus route as well for school buses in public transportation. So there's all those elements that have to be considered when you're trying to expand out, you know, sidewalk space as well. So just a little disclaimer on that.
You know, Jaime, given this discussion, this may be an opportunity to take a walk through downtown on, you know, sidewalks. Someone mentioned the idea of more open space or a market place, or like a New England town green, and the whole parking issue. It might be worth a look-see at that. You know, just I know you've all know it so well, but like the waterfront, it might be.
Well, speaking of convergent conversations, perhaps it's time to converge in on a recommendation for the next step. Would everybody like to see that, like a walkthrough of the downtown as well? One that focused on that? All right, we'll do that.
One addition that I would make here, because I would be very excited to do that walk, is that the economist Thomas Sowell says there are no solutions, only trade-offs. And I feel like that is super relevant in this conversation, where no matter what we do, it's going to have some kind of impact on something else. And one of the realizations that the DRWC had when you were on it, Jeff, they did a SWOT analysis: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. And one of the weaknesses that they identified is that we have a resistance to change. As a community, one of the things, let's keep it how it is. Even if it's not working, let's just kind of keep it how it is. And so one of the things that I would like to do fundamentally is to say, we are interested in advancement and in change. It will have some trade-offs, which we want to mitigate the negatives of as much as possible, but it's all in service of advancing our village. So what does that mean for this work specifically? What it means is that many of the kinds of recommendations that were made in that group's work, for example, when it comes to transportation, is huge, and we'll get to transportation with respect to this work later on. But the larger point is, you can see a through line of many of the studies that have been done in the past through to today of the kinds of recommendations that have been made. The same kind of recommendations over and over. And so to me, identifying some of the key ones, whether it's expanding the sidewalk, or really we're talking about like in our downtown, that huge parking lot that's in front of the post office, like that needs to not be a parking lot. That's pretty clear. That is not the best use of that space. So how can we not just imagine what should be there, but think about the kind of democracy reform, the kind of foundational environmental, the substrate, the stuff that the stuff grows in, that is the stuff that needs to change, and that's cultural for us here in the village. And so what that means is we need some champions. We need some people that are going to be, that have legitimacy and that have enough cultural capital within our community to say, these are changes that I want to see, that we want to see. There are trade-offs, but we want to see them. Because it cannot just be Omar Lopez and Manny Quesada and Frank Fish and Melissa Banta saying, but we should do this, and not have other voices involved really championing this change once we get to that point, or else this will be yet one more set of recommendations of things that we know we need to do different, but we still haven't found a way to do.
Well, to that point, sort of what Rebecca was talking about earlier and how we pull together all these voices during our process. I know we have the ideas wall and the surveys and all the opportunities on the website. I would just encourage everyone to continue ushering people to those areas to, you know, have their voice part of this process. In that regard, my question would be, do we have the capability to quantify that data in some type of way so that we as a steering committee can kind of analyze that? I know we're kind of compiling it on the website and in the software, but I'm just interested to know, just as you know, we're going to now start doing the feedback loops with the subcommittees, is there a way to start quantifying the feedback we're getting on the website through the surveys and the ideas wall, so it can kind of you know, feed our conversation going forward, and we know that our perspectives are not just ours, and we're kind of filtering it through the data that's coming in and the voices that are expressing themselves on the website?
Yes. So the quick answer to that is yes, and sort of some caveats. So yes, there are comments that are coming in, and we can definitely get you the feedback that tells you how many people come on. But I think that it's really important to note, especially for those of you in the community who don't come to these meetings, who don't get on the ideas wall, who don't fill out surveys, that those people have opinions and they matter too. And so a lot of times with ideas walls and, you know, stuff that you're going to get coming through the normal channels, that represents one segment of the population. But the goals and the needs of the village are for everybody who comes here, everybody who lives here, everybody who works here. And so you need to be concerned for all those individuals that you're having conversations, all those people that you're that may not be communicating in those areas. I think that, you know, despite the fact that we have gotten a lot of comments, I don't believe we've received a single comment in Spanish. Not one. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody, you know, isn't comfortable writing comments in English, have irrelevant opinions. It just means that for whatever reason, we've received 0 comments in Spanish. And so it's important that you want to more than just that.
Sorry, let me just stop you right there for 1 minute, I guess, because there's obviously Omar Lopez and myself here.
I mean, on the ideas wall. I don't mean like in general.
I get that. But so maybe we should maybe Omar, we can have an internal discussion on this. But maybe, you know, if we're lacking of information being sent out to us or being transmitted to the rest of the community, maybe the 3 of us could actually, and with the help of Franco Simon, we actually start doing some of this stuff in Spanish. And I think that would be and start pushing things along that way and through different medias. Because if they're not seeing what we're seeing, obviously, or what we have been producing, then it's going to be hard for them to send you information, obviously, because if you're expecting someone to send you something in Spanish and all the documents on the Waterfront that then down are in English, and it's going to be kind of hard for them to follow some of this stuff. So I think if we want to be proactive, and then the proactivity part of the meeting has to be where, you know, we need to come out. We need to start showing, you know, communications and showing information out there for the Spanish community as well.
Yeah. And I want to add to that a little bit. I want to add to that. So Manny, what you said was brilliant. That's exactly right. We should definitely be doing some of this in Spanish, specifically in Spanish. And so we should definitely figure out how to do that. And I would love to see, in addition to, I mentioned the study halls for us here on the steering committee, to be able to talk about specific parts of this process in between meetings. In addition, what I would love to see is a little bit of a different cadence with how the work is shown. So let me show you what I'm talking about. So when I was in 5th grade, I had to hand in my math homework, and it would be right about 5th grade. You're learning kind of long division, and so I would just have like, it would be long division. I'm going somewhere with this, and I would just have like the answer, like 32, right? And my teacher would go, "Well, how did you get this answer? You have to show your work." right? And if somebody were to ask us, well, how did you get to these recommendations? Well, they would say like, well, take a look at these meetings. Well, like these meetings isn't exactly where that comes through. Where, well, how can someone see like how this is made? Here's my recommendation. If we were to have monthly in English and in Spanish, in an ideal world, I would love to do both. Think about it as like almost like a book club, okay? But instead of a book club, the book club is the chapter. And so in this case, it would be like the Waterfront that was just done. So it's like, okay, you have the community, you have 3 weeks to read the Waterfront chapter. And on Thursday night, what we're gonna do is have a book club conversation about it. Manny Casada is gonna be there. We're talking about celebrities. I'm talking about Omar Lopez gonna be there live and direct. And we're gonna have a conversation with anybody that wants to show up. And we could talk about this chapter. And people in the community could talk about it, and you could record it. And so that if somebody says, well, I didn't know about this, they could go back and hear not only our conversations that we're having that were really deep in it, but community thoughts as the chapters are coming together, which will actually also give you, BFJ, an opportunity to hear community thoughts in a little bit of a different way as this thing is coming together in ways that are a little bit more bite-sized, that are more accessible to people. Just an idea.
Yeah, Omar, thank you. But if I could just answer, Melissa had a question there, and I just wanted to say that, Melissa, the survey, for instance, and all surveys have the same, no matter where we are, we never get much more than a 10% of the community, sometimes 15% of the community. But you asked about data, and as soon as the survey is over, it is one data source, and we'll be able to present to you all of those answers. Who answered what? We've asked specific questions, for instance, about items that we discussed tonight, parking downtown, heights, things that we discussed, we've asked in the survey, so that you will get a data source there. And the same on the Ideas Board, we can present some results of that. And then, as we go on, we'll get data sources for you.
I do know that too, that in terms of the Spanish translation of documents, that the website does have the tab where you can view everything in Spanish. But as we were saying, that's not the only source of information. I know back when times were simpler, when we were brainstorming before we knew where we would be as far as being able to meet with people in the community, we were going over different ideas of how to make sure that we're reaching everyone in an equitable manner, that, not everyone has access to a computer to fill out a survey, and not everyone's comfortable communicating that way. So I think one of the ideas that we did bring up before was these kind of like stakeholder type of outreaches, where I guess, I don't know what format it was going to take, whether it be people on the steering committee or people from, your organization, but facilitating those meetings, whether they be Zoom oriented or however they are, to try to expand our conversations with people. Because as we were talking earlier, just how everyone learns differently, everyone communicates differently also, as we know. And so I'd be interested to see how we can become more innovative going forward with how we're reaching out to stakeholders in the community to get their feedback from their, I guess, spheres of influence, if you will. I think that will be a key component to kind of, under the constraints that we have, not really being able to say, hey, everybody come to the library. We can't really do that now. So I think that would be a good kind of like plan B, just FYI.
I have done this survey a couple of days ago. I just went online and filled out all the questions. There are a few things that sort of came up, that various questions you have got only 3 options to answer, or a maximum of 3 boxes to tick. And the other thing, so that felt somewhat restrictive. And then there is one other suggestion I would have, is maybe we should add a page where people actually can write out some thoughts they have over the whole process, or if they want to expand on a particular issue, because that option isn't there. It's in that respect a closed survey.
Frank, you're right. And we found in a survey mechanism that it's very difficult at the end For instance, Melissa was asking about data points. What we're trying to survey is to get those data points, and they're not, this is, I mean, we could do that. We could add open-ended questions, but we can't add them up. We can't quantify them. That's why we've tried to do this. The survey, by the way, is only one element of what we're trying to do. So, for instance, the ideas wall is more open-ended in doing that. But the survey, we've got to be able to somehow get at, what do people feel about a certain question? So that's just the mechanism of doing the survey. I think, though, we can find, to have, in fact, at the end of this presentation, if we have a little time, we got a couple of slides on more what we're planning in the future. And I'm hoping also that if we do stay in stage 4, and this what the governor is allowing now, as we've been very fortunate in Westchester with this COVID-19, that we could get to some meetings perhaps in the early fall, and maybe this is something that's Jaime or Omar or Manny in Spanish. Reaching out to parts of the community that may not be responding to this, but that's up to you. But I think I just wanted to answer Melissa's question. We will have data points on that survey, and the idea board for you.
Yeah, I think that idea of doing some sessions in Spanish is something that is a great idea. We need to kind of think about that internally to figure out how we get the logistics of that down. But I think that's a great idea. And I want to say just real fast, we made real heavy tweaks to this meeting to try to engage the steering committee members. So far, from my perspective, it seems to have worked. I want to see just if we can, with like the next 30 seconds, see whether or not people are comfortable with the way that this meeting was held, and then kind of hand it back to Simon, because I know we're sort of 15 minutes past our normal meeting time. And it's a lot to ask for people to get 2 hours. So we do want to kind of help everybody get to the end of this, because I'm sure all of you didn't intend on sitting here till midnight. So, so did everybody? Was this meeting? What is everybody's impression of the sort of the level of engagement from this meeting? Was it more useful to you? Thumbs up, medium, down. All right. All right.
All right, I'll dive back in over here. Give me a second, I'll share my screen again. Okay. Make that full screen. You guys all see it? Okay.
Yeah, it's up, Simon.
Great. So the next kind of section here that we're thinking about are these ideas about issues and opportunities. And Frank Budding, I think this is the slide that you've been waiting for. There are here first national economic trends, and the next slide is more local and regional trends. But at a national level, these are things that we know are happening around us. We're not going to prevent them here in Austining, but we do need to be prepared for them and plan for them. And we'd like to dig in on each of these, but for tonight, maybe we do just focus a little bit on COVID here. I'll just make a couple of big sort of observations first, and then ask all of you to weigh in particular on what you've been hearing locally. So maybe keep that in mind. But a couple of things that I want to highlight is that there are, and you all know this much more than we do, there are some things that the village is actively doing right now as short-term response to COVID. And the one example that that we've heard, we at BFJ have heard, is something on the fine-grained level of, all right, what if we get to the winter time and there's restrictions on how many people can eat inside of a restaurant? How does a restaurant provide outdoor service in the wintertime in the midst of COVID? There are things like that the village is trying to work out as we speak, and they hopefully will be resolved long before the comprehensive plan is done. Also, there are some medium and long-term issues that the comprehensive plan should address. There are not those short-term issues. What should the village be doing today? It's what does the village need to be prepared for if this drags on for the long term, or to provide some flexibility in case something like this comes up again, so that we're not caught off guard. That's what we want to focus on in the comprehensive plan. Are those issues that are more medium term, long term. How do you provide the flexibility, as Frank, you've talked about in the email that you sent today? And how do you make sure that the business community is able to quickly respond and bounce back? There's a couple of resources that we've been looking at. One, for example, is here on the right, an organization called NACTO is thinking about how public space can be reimagined. Now, maybe that's a short-term thing, right? Making slow speed streets so that there's space for pedestrians and bicyclists to be able to switch while moving through the village. That's a short-term answer, but it's also something to develop and have in your toolbox in case you need to do something like this in the future. So that's just one example of something that we might start to think about. But the questions here at the bottom that I was interested in as a starting point is, I know the businesses in Austining are, I'm sure a lot are struggling. It's a hard time for businesses all over the country. What are you hearing from them? What are they kind of thinking about in the long term in terms of what resources are that they need in order to bounce back? How are they adapting to some of these social distancing rules? And are there some creative solutions that you've heard about that you think could be benefits in the long term?
Let me add, Simon, here. I'd keep in mind too that what we're doing though is a comprehensive plan that is over the next 10 years. So a lot of the very short term may not be a big comprehensive plan issue. It's likely, for instance, that we will have a vaccine next year. I might be wrong on that. The scientists might be wrong on that. But if we do, then a lot of the shorter term issues are not huge COVID-19 issues. Frank B., I don't know what you feel about that, but the comprehensive plan does have to look a little bit also over the next 10 years. So there are some short-term, which is, sidewalks that accommodate restaurants now in the next few months, but that may not be an issue next summer.
No, but you might find that a number of companies are going to say, well, that homework that actually works very well, and so we're going to close down offices in New York or wherever they have major office facilities, and that would mean that we have a different use of the village, because more people are home, they will be doing more local shopping, they will be hopefully use more local business. But I think there will be some permanent changes in use patterns of communities.
I think that's one thing we see that happening a lot, and I think there is a trend that has already started, say 5 or 6 or maybe 10 years ago, that this COVID-19 has made very much in the forefront. You've probably seen several articles in the New York Times and Wall Street Journal on the idea of corporations now looking at satellite offices in White Plains and Stamford and move out of New York City to the suburbs.
And that will impact us.
Yeah, and that will tend to impact the major centers. And then yourself, as a smaller village, you may see more, as we are everywhere, seeing more people working at home or working at that satellite office being sometimes in a place like White Plains. But I think there, in a way, that's going to encourage more things that you might not like to see. I don't know. That is more individual travel. One of the things that is short term now favoring the suburbs is that you're able to get in your car, go park, and go to work. That you don't have to take mass transit, you don't have to take the subway, you don't have to go in an elevator in a building. So those things also are sort of, some immediate impacts of COVID-19, but that part of it may recede a little bit as we get a vaccine and, we're into 2021 and 2022, where I think your point's a very good one, is that a lot more people corporations it's into their advantage to enable people to work at home if they can keep the productivity up, because it will reduce their rents. So that more and more, and we should look at, we've talked about this in the zoning code, you already have some of this, but making sure it's, people can easily work from home.
Mm-hmm.
I'll chime in here.
In the master plan, what I think I'd like to emphasize is that we should look a little bit at the next 10 years. This is, our job, I think, is not going to be to solve the immediate sidewalk question of restaurants in the next 6 months. In other words, the comprehensive plan needs to look a little bit more at the longer term trends.
Yeah. So one of the things that if you compare the last comprehensive plan to this one, that I feel like was very much missing, which was clear articulation about how we are taking into account our demographics. So we have a large Spanish-speaking population, a large population of folks who have housing as a need because they are rent burdened or mortgage burdened. I don't know if you know that's a thing, but like the housing burden, the cost of housing is very, very high. There are kind of fundamentals that we know are true. So with respect to your question of how do we bounce back from 2019, from COVID-19, what adaptations are being made? One of the things that we're seeing is just the fundamentals that have existed really being blown up and amplified, so that we have a large number of people, for example, that are part of the economy here in Ossining, that are part of the informal economy. They're not plugged in to the formal economy. And as a result, when tragedy happens in our community like this, when we rely on government services, there are a number of people that don't qualify for these government services. And so we're unable to serve them in the same way. So what this means for me in terms of what the next 10 years looks like is, what are we learning about the fundamentals of our community that nonprofits like Open Door, like Neighbors Link, that are really have their eyes and ears on the ground, can tell us about what needs are in the community that we can help to ensure that particularly the most vulnerable in our community have what they need in order to be able to advance. Because the reality is, somebody like me, I'm able to work from home. I can drive where I gotta drive. Like, how is COVID-19 affected? The restaurants have takeout, I can go get takeout or get delivery. You know what I mean? Like, there are ways of being able to adapt. And the restaurants that not just restaurants, like the businesses that are either corporate, so they have support from larger networks, or that are the largest within our community, have been able to adapt. They're the ones with the websites. They're the ones with the curbside drop off, all that kind of stuff. I'm worried about the mom and pops, the real small businesses, where it's just a couple, where it was a single proprietor, and they're not plugged in the same way. And so how can we support them and recognize, well, how are we building an infrastructure, whether that's like looking at what does a bid look like. One of the questions was like, is there a network of Black and Hispanic businesses in Ossining? No, there is not. There's no way of communicating. There isn't even an email list of all the businesses that we can just send an email to all the businesses that are around. So there are fundamentals that exist that we need to fix over the course of the next 10 years to ensure that when the next large issue comes, and believe me, it's coming. If it's climate change, if it's population change, these things are coming. We need to be able to support the most vulnerable within our community, not just because it's a nice thing to do, but because that is the lifeblood of our community. We cannot have this kind of suffering and tragedy with our community and expect things to be moving forward willy-nilly. We need to be able to take care of the folks that have the highest needs in our community, but also we need to look forward to what are the other fundamentals that exist so that we can be set up. So that's it, I'll leave it at that.
Omar, I think that is a great point. I think I should mention what I think is the limitation sometimes of a comprehensive plan, and it does tend to deal with, infrastructure, zoning, land uses by nature, and to get at real needs of people who are not, as you said, sometimes the mainstream of the community. They can't get in their car and just drive to work, or they are not on the internet or can't work from home. They really need some social service organizations, some not-for-profits, and they need also things like, access to government programs and food stamps, those types of social services that are needed. We can say that in the comprehensive plan, but we can't, you know what I mean? We're not able to effectuate some of those changes, for instance, that they are going to be debating intensively in the next 2 weeks in Congress. So there's going to be some limitations on what we can do, other than to absolutely support what you were saying, and also I would love to be able to, through you and the committee and others, we are open to some, you know, as soon as we can, have some meetings with groups where you can get them together. We found in the past that meeting with, in a church basement, to give you an example, or a place where some of the more disadvantaged members or rent-burdened members of your community, or mortgage-burdened, are more comfortable going. They're not taking surveys. I mean, Jaime has a good point. I could do a survey in Greenwich, Connecticut, and only 15% of the people are going to answer that survey. So it's a matter of also, in a community like Ossining, where you have a much more diverse population, to get them involved.
Melissa, I've noticed you come off mute a couple of times. I don't want to.
No, just to this, really quickly to this point, I think, going forward, we should start rethinking when we're talking about lessons learned from COVID, or planning, or implementing plans into this comprehensive plan with COVID in mind, not necessarily specifically COVID, but the lessons that we've learned coming out of it, and how we can build the structures within this plan that kind of support the community rather than leave the community vulnerable. There's many instances that we can point to that are feasible, to put into a comprehensive plan. I mean, we know access to Wi-Fi was one really big thing, that came out of this for everyone, whether you were working from home or you had, children that were at home. So just thinking like that will kind of help fuel our vision for the plan, not necessarily saying, oh, this is only a short-term concern because of COVID, but, analyzing some of the trends that will come out of this, as we've been discussing, some of the shifts in the economy that will also ultimately shift how, towns and businesses structure themselves, and keeping that in mind as we build this plan. Like, I think when we first came into this, before COVID, our vision was, okay, how do we take the old plan and figure out what's missing, and, take out what's missing and put back, put something else in its place, or expand upon it a bit. Now we're at a point where we have to be way more innovative with that, right? Because it's more than just, like, the old plan is almost like so archaic now compared to what the needs of the future potentially are. And so I think we definitely have to be mindful of whatever these trends are telling us coming out of this pandemic, especially when it comes to access, and how we can make sure that our village is much more accessible and much more, has much more resources for people, regardless of what's, whether there's some type of, pandemic or whatever going on that kind of just has the world standing still. So that's just a really quick part of that. I think we should make sure we're viewing it through that lens of what we've learned from the pandemic, not necessarily, COVID itself is going to be a memory soon. But the lessons we learn certainly should not be, like, purged from our thinking as we go forward.
It's about
I apologize for having to do this, but I do want to drill down on that comment, Melissa. One of the things you mentioned is that COVID has presented a real lack of, like, Wi-Fi and access to internet and things like that. And so I think that, some of that is because things are closed right now. But I'm curious, is there an issue of a lack of space for, you know, some people in the low-income community to get to a public space? Because I know you can go to the library, but maybe the library is not the closest place in the world for everybody. Is there an issue of sort of the disbursement of the availability of public, you know, spaces to use the internet for people who want to get on the internet? Is there enough? I mean, should the village be considering whether or not we need to invest more in providing public access to you know, computer terminals and Wi-Fi? Are these issues that like we should be thinking about?
So Jaime, I'll just answer that because we work with the school district a lot on this. We have a lot of hotspots in Austin, but they were very hard for people to access. And when you took away places where people typically went library, then you really had a lot of challenges because the providers were actually good about making things that were typically charging for free. But if you didn't have the technology, if you didn't have the access to the, you know what it just was complicated. So the school districts worked a lot for people, and Melissa, you may know better about the progress they've made there. There was Wi-Fi, but accessing it was hard. And in a pandemic, when people were forced to do it from their homes, it really became a huge challenge, so much so that I believe like a significant portion of the kids in our district are not really able to homeschool. But Melissa, I don't know if that was on my conversations with the Ray. I don't know if I got that right.
So yeah, you're right. It was a combination of either the Wi-Fi access and or a device in which to even access, you know, but I think in this particular instance, it was because there were, you know, those public spaces where people usually went to access devices for the internet. That wasn't even an option. So it created this like compounded situation where it was a mixture of access and device access as well that contributed to, you know, the deficit. So I think that, you know, that's an area we can be a bit more innovative on as far as, you know, I don't know what that looks like. I'm not in the IT business, but, you know, I think that, you know, there's room to.
Most of the public access spaces were indoors. And there are some places like New Rochelle that has provided outdoor Wi-Fi in public spaces.
But it's not practical for kids who are schooling. It's just not. They're not going to be able to do that outdoors. So that was one thing we learned. Like homeschooling works exceptionally well for some children, and it just doesn't for others. Even though there may be outdoor opportunities, it's not the applications for it during a pandemic for working for school just aren't, it's not a viable option.
Yeah, what we're gathering from some other places we're working in is just that it's access to Wi-Fi from the home. They need access to it, and sometimes people don't either have the equipment or the computer or the capability of the Wi-Fi access in their home, because to homeschool, the definition is, or to do some classes at home, which school districts are even looking at for the fall now, you've got to have access to the internet from your home base. But I think that's a very good point. Access to Wi-Fi is
I know that
long-term, that's important for the educational system.
I know that there are cities, not just in the United States, but all around the world that have provided public Wi-Fi networks that have a reach throughout the entire city. And there's different technologies like mesh networks and things like that. But it seems to me like the issues being raised around access to Wi-Fi are sort of like equity issues. And maybe that's something we should look at as an investment for our community, so that we're like building resilience if, you know, not just for like this current pandemic, but as Omar said, we don't know what's around the corner. And maybe that's like a public benefit that we should be looking at providing, you know, to everyone in our community, wherever you are.
And I think that's right. And remember, there are no solutions, only trade-offs. It's not going to be free. It's not going to be easy. But I think it'll be worth it. Something like that could have enormous benefits for our community. The reality is, of course, the people that have the means to already have internet in their homes already have it, and so they're not going to benefit from it. And those are also the people that tend to be most involved in politics, and so they're not going to be the ones that are going to be pushing for it. And so this is a place where we're able, I think, to push for something that can have massive benefits in our community. Because the reality is, if you have public Wi-Fi, that requires people to physically go, even if it's outside, so that is pandemic friendly, you need to physically go to a place. And if you have parents that are working, what are you going to send kids there by themselves? That's not a viable option. There's a million things that reasons why it's not a final solution. But I think that ultimately looking into it, considering what would be the cost of something like that and what would be the benefit, I think would definitely be worth it. And particularly if you can think about creative ways of, could this be sponsored by something? You don't have a ton of like small communities that have it. So maybe you can find a cell phone carrier or some other kind of, we only have a few different ISPs, internet service providers here in the community, Verizon, Optimum, etc. But find one of them that have the worst PR right now, and here's a way for them to turn around their PR. Find something to be able to leverage for us to be able to do this. I think that there is a way.
I mean, I think if I recall correctly, Yonkers actually has some sort of program that provides free internet to low-income individuals, and that's everybody who goes to the public school system. That's something that Yonkers is doing now. I mean, they were doing this long before COVID. So there are other communities that have found ways to get to this answer. I'm not sure if this is like purely a comprehensive plan issue. If it is, then Frank, please let me know. If it's not, then I think this is useful information otherwise for us to look into.
Yeah, I do think it's worth mentioning. We're going to have a whole sustainable infrastructure chapter, and we're going to have a section there on energy, but I think we should mention this, access to Wi-Fi. It's not a normal comp plan issue, but I think it's very important in Ossining, and we ought to cover it. We ought to cover it. I won't say that, as I'll say it another way than Omar did. Everything's a trade-off. So, but I think this is very important to mention because it affects schooling, and it's going to be a longer-term issue, and it's an issue particularly in communities that are not the Greenwich, Connecticut's of the world. Where people can just afford to buy everything themselves or buy access through Verizon or so on. So I think we ought to mention it, Jaime.
Okay.
So, by the way, it is 9:45, so could Simon, could I suggest we try to finish by 10 and maybe Simon could finish up a few more slides? I don't mean to, but I find, after a couple hours, people get tired.
Great. Okay, so the next bit, I think we've touched on a lot of this here on local and regional economic trends. There's been some discussion about local jobs, so that's something that we can talk about, and maybe we expand on this a little bit more because this could be a whole. This should be a longer conversation of a good half an hour that maybe we focus on in a study hall. I'd like to hear from all of you. And what's been working without cutting this one short. Local economic development. The last piece here is focusing on some of these specific areas. We've talked quite a bit about land use in the downtown, building scale and so on. But a lot of what we're actually getting at is how are we going to drive more activity here? Make it a more attractive place to live, a more attractive place for people to visit. What I'm interested, maybe in just a couple of minutes, in hearing about here is what are some of the things that happen now that are most effective, most successful in terms of bringing people into the downtown. It could be activities, it could be the types of businesses, it could be that there's a handful of good restaurants. What is it that brings all of you into downtown Austin?
Not everybody all at once,
Well, do special events, for instance, farmers market, do special events bring people in?
Yeah, I mean, definitely the farmers market, the village
Yeah.
fair, the I think it's the Portuguese festival they have. There's a lot of events that of course we've had to forego over the past, over this summer, that traditionally bring in a lot of people to that area. So there's those events, and then there's just like the everyday activity going on down there. But definitely, like, you know, things like the village fair and things like that are the biggest draw, a one-time event that draws people to that area. Christmas tree lighting, you know, all of that.
Okay. Well, can I pick up oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, the scale of the place is pleasant. It's a very pleasant place to sort of arrive on an afternoon, wonder about, shop, eat, have the excitement of the river. All those elements, and the size and the outlook of the buildings, they give a very friendly village atmosphere. And I think that's a very important draw into Ossining for visitors. And that is something we should build up on and expand upon, I guess.
Right.
Compared with a place like White Plains, well, there's no incentive to go and visit White Plains whatsoever. It's a deadpan place with featureless streets and so on. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
No, thank you, Frank. Yeah. Look, can I pick up on I just have a question on the 2015 study, the downtown study. There were several comments on creation of a public open space. And for instance, I'll just use the term New England Town Green. Is there a space that functions that way now, or is one of the parking lots an opportunity to do that?
Yeah, you know, and I would think about like the way New Rochelle has used the sort of the green space next to their downtown library.
Right.
Something comparable to what could happen if you put a green right in the middle and said, hey, we're gonna move that parking volume somewhere else to a parking structure, and we're gonna take those 20-odd spaces and turn them into a park, turn them into a green. Is that?
I think John Zeltzman, who runs the Ossining Downtown Farmers Market, I don't want to speak for him, but I remember him saying during the DRWC that he was even open to the idea that move this farmers market into, close down Spring Street and move it into the street, you know, as a different way to configure the farmers market than having it in that specific lot. In other words, that it's flexible, you can move it to other places. And that was one of the other, you know, since we're talking about things that bring people downtown. I know there was the slide about the slow streets before, but the idea of maybe on weekends or even like more permanently closing parts of streets and opening them up as pedestrian plazas. And I don't know exactly like what's the specific right place to do that, but those are ideas that, you know, other cities are doing successfully.
Great.
Okay.
The next area here is, I talked about these a bit at the beginning, but these gateway corridors. The reason I call them gateways, not just corridors, is because this is in a way, you know, somebody's first impression entering the village. And got here on the next slide, this is a diagram that Jonathan did that really helped a lot of us sort of understand this Upper Croton area a little bit more. And what he's done here, Jonathan, I'm just going to touch on a couple of quick points. I know there's a lot of information here as I get my laser pointer, but there are areas like these that are highlighted in blue that aren't really creating a strong street edge like you've got in parts of the downtown that make it feel walkable and friendly to pedestrians. And then you've got other areas like these that are outlined in green that are creating more of a pedestrian scale because those buildings are pushed up to the street and are forming more of a wall. and it makes it more comfortable for a pedestrian than areas where the buildings are more scattered and you feel like you're walking in a sea of parking lots. And within all of that context, there is this big site right in the middle on Prospect and that's Watson, which feels like an opportunity. You know, we could talk about zoning changes and so on, and areas that are already developed might very slowly change over time. But this feels like a big anchor that could you know, could have some kind of improvement and start to strengthen that edge along here, so that Upper Croton Avenue doesn't feel quite so much like a sort of a highway entering the village. It starts to feel more like it's not the downtown. It's different from the downtown, but it still is a place that welcomes you as a pedestrian. So that there's a couple of things that we're thinking about in terms of these gateway corridors. And then the last bit in terms of these focus areas are the commercial nodes. This includes Roosevelt Square, which I just talked about a little bit, but then also the Arcadian shopping center down here on the southern part of Route 9. It's an area that we've even just internally we've only touched on a little bit, but you know, there are a lot of big questions about what the future of suburban shopping centers like this are. Thinking both about the impact of Amazon and online shopping, and also interest in creating more mixed use nodes. So these are these three different types of focus areas: the downtown, these gateway corridors, and these neighborhood commercial nodes.
So one point that I would like to make here is, because this is not my neighborhood, so I feel like I have an extra leg to stand on when we're talking about Upper Croton Avenue, is the tough thing about it is that there are a ton of businesses, storefronts in particular, that are owned and the owners are paying taxes on them, but they're not doing anything with them. That orange lot is one in particular. It was recently, relatively recently anyway, sold, and so I'll put that as an exception, because that potentially might have some move. We haven't heard anything about what's going to go there, but potentially something can go there. But all along that whole corridor, there are all these businesses that are empty, and yet the owners pay taxes on them, and so you can't, as a village, leverage that as a way to be able to do something with them. But they're not doing anything with them. And so it's not clear to me what kind of mechanism we have to be able to spur them to do something. But that's, to me, a significant issue.
Yeah, Omar, you've hit upon an issue we run into everywhere, that because it's private ownership, you either try to approach it over time with things like a form-based code, or you've got to be able to put resources, money, financing into that. The other methods we've talked about is a business improvement district. That's not easy to do because it needs the votes of those owners. So sometimes they view that as taxing themselves. So it's not an easy issue. I don't know who owns this particular parcel. Do you know who owns it, or? Yeah.
Maybe Jaime will be able to answer that question, because I know they issued a permit demo a while back, and there were some sort of studies in that particular parcel, I guess. But maybe Jaime has a little more in-depth information.
If you can give me a couple of minutes while you continue talking about other stuff, I will look it up.
That's great. So I do have a quick question in regards to the blue areas that you guys provided in here, and I'm looking at here. You have areas with excessive parking frontage along Croton Avenue. Could you explain that? What do you mean with excessive parking?
Jonathan, are you still on?
Yeah.
Maybe you could. This is your map, so maybe you could address that.
Sure, Manuel. This area showing there was really about the perception of how that parking is presented along the frontage. So, you know, when I said excessive. If we take a look at the square footage of these buildings and you do the parking ratios, the excessive doesn't relate to that. What it relates to is how it affects the pedestrian and the overall perception of people coming into the village. If you take a look at some of the images that are on the lower right-hand corner, yeah, down there, I mean, that's at the gateway where you sort of come in right on Pleasantville Road. There's a couple, architecturally, they're not fantastic buildings, but they're well presented along the street. There's a monument on the corner. I think these are things that we talk about in terms of placemaking and how you sort of create this entrance and pathway into the village. So as I was walking this corridor, it became a very different experience when you get down to sort of, I think this area is Roosevelt Square, where you just have pretty much everything that's in blue here is concrete or asphalt. And so those were areas that I called out that could be addressed in terms of improving the overall appearance and the pedestrian environment as you come into the village.
But that would be more like an aesthetic landscape
Yes,
research.
it is. It is.
Correct.
Maybe excessive
Correct.
isn't the word we might want to use, but and the issue with that is that usually the government as such doesn't have direct control over that. So your ability to handle it is when they come in. If one of these stores came in, or one of these shopping areas came in, the parcels came in to the planning board for an expansion, then the planning board has the opportunity to get landscaping into those and get a redesign of those areas. I think they're worth pointing out in a plan. So the planning board has a plan to cite that's noted these parking areas are not, sort of a sea of asphalt, rather than still having enough parking for that store, but having it landscaped and designed well.
Thank you.
And just having zoning code be set up so that we're encouraging parking in the rear, and we want to get away from sort of the old strip mall.
Yes.
With the store setback and all the parking in the front, and more to like the sort of corridor, pedestrian friendly, and actually that is the way many of the older cities, if you look at architecture or older places that we really enjoy aesthetically, or historic places, all the buildings are right up on the roads, because we weren't so obsessed at that time with having all of this parking, and somehow we moved into this like era of strip malls, and we want to get back to that aesthetic feel, that community feel, but we still acknowledge that a lot of people drive cars and need places to park, but we just want to conceal the parking or put it in, not be a automobile first society.
Right.
And I think Jeff, you've hit, to me, that's the real trick of downtown in a corridor like this. If you look at, like, if we were to do some sidebars in this chapter, if you look at a place like Rye, Bronxville, Tarrytown, New Canaan, Greenwich, they've all tried to do those things to one degree or another. But as Omar said, there's trade-offs. So they've tried to put the parking, they've tried to accommodate the parking, but in smaller lots in back of the stores, to have enough parking to landscape it well, light it well, but also then keep their main focus on, walkable downtown. And I think those places they've tried to accommodate both, if you will, the automobile and the pedestrian, because without that type of what Frank B mentioned, the scale of the place and the aesthetic of the place, and then at the same time being able to accommodate the automobile, but in a way, as Jonathan has kind of focused on here in a less excessive way. But these other communities, there are models for it, I think, that have succeeded. Rye goes way back to one planner, a long time ago. It was actually Frederick Clark himself who said to the Rye, and he convinced the Rye board that, you know, put the parking lots, get them designed in back of Purchase Street, which is their main drag. And they, over time, did that. And so that's why you have a nice street there. Bronxville kept their main high street, so to speak, you know, Pondfield Road, but they have parking immediately adjacent in back of those buildings and all along the railroad there. It's kind of a different setup, but they've been able to blend the two. And I think, as someone mentioned, there's no silver bullet here. There's got to be a mixture, the right mixture of sidewalks, scale that's comfortable to people, perhaps a central green space, and parking. Because without that, you're not going to succeed in getting people to continue to shop downtown.
Yeah, the owner of the building, the lot in question is AMAC Development LLC. I don't know. So I think it's just a name. There's a group that's underneath it, but I can't find anything about them.
Okay.
All right.
I'm familiar with AMAC.
Okay, so this is one more slide here on the downtown chapter, and it's really just you know, a handful of other questions that I didn't get into in the earlier discussion, and maybe these are things to think about for our study hall. We've touched on a couple of them. The idea of the business improvement district has come up, as Frank said, and as Manny pointed out, that's something that's going to have some trade-offs. We've just spent a good bit of time talking about public realm improvements. I say downtown here, but I think given the conversation that we've just had, I think it's clear that it's not just about the downtown. It's also about these corridors and neighborhood commercial nodes as well. We talked about broadband. We didn't get into 5G, but these are not the same thing, but they have a relationship in terms of the type of infrastructure that goes in to support them. That's something to maybe continue talking about. And Omar mentioned this last bit earlier. This was I didn't know the answer to this, but this is a question that I wanted to ask because it came up in our recent work in Peekskill, where there is a business improvement district, which is somewhat active. There is a chamber of commerce, but one of the things that we heard as we were able to speak with some representatives of Latino business community and African American business community is that those shops, those restaurants, those stores do not feel represented by these local business organizations. And so, if it sounds like that might be the case here. I think we want to acknowledge it and try to think about how that can be changed over time. If it's not the case, you know, if these different communities, business communities do have an organized presence, then that's a great thing, and that might be something that we want to build upon. But that's why we wanted to put the question out there, is to try to get a sense from all of you what that status is. And I think Omar gave us a sense. Are there any other responses to these questions that you all want to talk about now, or anything else that you think is important here for this chapter that we haven't touched on? And we can start filling in those details. Anybody? If not, thanks for sticking with.
Yeah.
It was a really great conversation.
I did want to mention one last thing. Before you say your buys, I apologize, Simon. One of the things that had been brought up in the past was like just trying to get the meeting minutes and notes of this particular meeting back to the board. So I was wondering if we could kind of nail down when do you think we would be able to get back to this committee, sort of meeting minutes of this meeting, so that so we can make sure that we got all the comments.
It's probably Sylvia who's going to be doing most of the work on that, so I don't want to overpromise for her, but maybe I think can we say Monday? Is that?
Oh, I would think, can we give Sylvia a little bit more time? I know, Sylvia, you got
I have
one.
a few things on my plate, yes.
Yeah,
but-
can we say mid next week, maybe Wednesday or Thursday?
Yeah, I'm okay.
Is that okay?
Committee okay with that?
Yeah.
Thumbs up?
Great.
And I'll just to wrap up, I'll go through. We did want to give you all a bit of an update on public outreach that we've been doing. We've talked about the subcommittees earlier on. I'll remind you all that we're going to have the economic development subcommittee meeting next week, and we'll let you all know on Friday what the date and time is going to be. A reminder about the online tools. The Ideas Wall is a reminder we've extended through September 14th. The public survey is open. And we had a conversation with Karen and Jaime earlier today about the interactive map and some of the features that we're going to be deploying there. So stay tuned for that as well. We wanted to give you all a little bit of data here on what we've heard so far. The kind of nice thing is, in just the first week plus in the public survey, we had over 300 responses. That's pretty good. But one of the things that we need to lean on all of you about is making sure that we continue getting the word out. There was a great sort of flood of responses in the first couple of days, and as would be expected, it's tailed off a bit in terms of sort of new responses per day. So please help us out. If you've put this out to folks that you know in the community, maybe those of you who have chime in right now just quickly and let everyone else know how you've been able to spread this around. That might give others a sense of what they could do. And if you haven't, then please, social media, email lists, any other ways you can get this around.
Yeah. Actually, by raise of hands, how many of you have filled out the survey? Oh, I'm not seeing everybody's hands. So start with yourself filling out the survey, and then go and find 10 friends and try to convince them to fill out the survey.
There was I was copied on an email. There was a member of the public who commented that they were uncomfortable with the question that asks your income range. And I forget when I filled it out if you were able to opt out of that question, but just to follow up on that, is there a way we can add an opt-out option if we haven't already done that?
Those questions are already optional. If you don't fill them in, then it'll still let you go on to the next page and submit the survey.
Yeah, that's a simple answer. They don't have to fill that in.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, I saw that email as well, and I know Stuart went through all of them individually, and it's definitely, you do not have to answer it.
Right.
Great. So please, Karen, were you gonna? Oh no, sorry. Okay. Yeah. So please just help us continue getting the word out. The village is gonna also keep up the great work they've been doing on social media on the village's Facebook page. To continue getting it out that way. And I think just a couple of other quick things here is, I don't know, for the trustees, I don't know if there's a place at your regular meetings where you could, I know folks watch those meetings, so where you could put in a plug for
There's definitely a place.
Okay, great.
They do announcements. We'll put in more plugs.
Thanks, Karen. Hey, Karen, as the what we find too is as that public survey has a deadline, and I find when people realize it, I think it's August 7th. When people realize it, we sometimes get a little bit of an oomph there, a little bit of an extra shot of people filling it out.
Okay. And just to wrap here, this is just what we're continuing to work on, the subcommittee meetings as we move forward. The public survey again, and I threw this date on here. I mean, we do want comments from all of you on the Waterfront chapter. Does July 31st work? Do you need more time to read through the Waterfront chapter and send us comments, or does that sound good? The balance here is
So
just
we're gonna have a walk. We're gonna set up a walk around for the waterfront, and then also I think we were talking about doing. We have here like a study hall on sea level rise and flooding. If I can make a recommendation that we hold off on a few things, because we have the CAD study we have that meeting with the CAD group. We're gonna have the walkthrough, and we're gonna have the study hall. Let's wait until those are done before we require the committee comments.
Good point. Yeah.
Sure, that's good. That's fine, Jaime, yeah. Yeah, I would just urge to set, maybe, Jaime, you'll know best, but maybe after the next committee meeting, which is August 18th, we could set a deadline for, end of August or something. Deadlines, yeah.
We're going to work tomorrow to start trying to figure out what the dates are for those other next items.
That's great.
By that time, we can schedule the subcommittee meeting too, so that probably.
Yeah, that'd be great, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
So disregard the July 31st date.
Yeah, no, yeah.
We'll be back in touch on that.
But I think the important thing is the next committee meeting is August 18th, right?
Yep. Yes.
I think us, Karen, unless there's something else, I think that's a wrap up for us.
Yeah, that's all we had.
You're muted, Karen.
Thanks, everybody. Been a long night.
Thank you very much.
I appreciate everybody's time.
Good night.
Thank you all.
Take care.
Night.